Chapter 1. The House of Secrets. Harry could have stayed at the Burrow. It would have been temptingly easy to let Mrs. Weasley fuss over him, to lose himself in the familiar chaos of red hair and shouting voices and meals that appeared without his asking. But Dumbledore's voice echoed in his memory. Calm, infuriating, final. And Harry knew he needed to be somewhere that felt like his own grief, not borrowed comfort. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, had been his inheritance twice over now. First from Sirius, who had died hating the place, and now from Dumbledore, who had left him nothing but questions and the weight of impossible knowledge. The house key felt cold in Harry's palm as Remus unlocked the door, the familiar shriek of Mrs. Black's portrait greeting them like a crow's harsh welcome. Still as charming as ever, Tonks muttered, her hair flashing through 3 different shades of brown as she winced. Her hand rested protectively over her still flat stomach, a gesture Harry had noticed becoming more frequent since the wedding. The sight should have been comforting, but everything felt strange now, shifted slightly left of where it should be, like looking at the world through a broken lens. The house was different. Harry couldn't quite name how, but the shadows seemed deeper, the air thicker, with the weight of old magic and older secrets. During his stay here 2 summers ago, the place had felt oppressive in the way of a prison, all dust and decay and Mrs. Black's endless screaming. Now it felt watchful, expectant. "I'll check the wards," Remus said, already moving toward the back of the house, with the purposeful stride of a man grateful for a task. Tonks followed him, murmuring something about the kitchen that Harry didn't quite catch. Their footsteps faded, leaving him alone in the entrance hall, with the weight of silence pressing against his eardrums. That was when he heard it, the soft, rhythmic muttering coming from somewhere above. "Master Regulus's final orders. Must wait for the Potter boy. Not yet. Not yet." Harry's head snapped up, his heart hammering against his ribs. Kreacher. The house elf had been coherent during their last encounters, no longer the mad, muttering creature who had caused Sirius's death through his hatred and resentment. But this sounded different, urgent, almost frantic. Harry took the stairs 2 at a time, following the voice up past the first landing, where his and Ron's old bedroom sat empty, past the 2nd floor where Buckbeak had once roosted. The muttering grew louder as he climbed, and by the 3rd floor, a level of the house he'd never fully explored during the cleaning efforts, the words were clear enough to make his blood run cold. Hidden so long, protected the truth. Master Regulus knew, oh yes, he knew what the old man would do. Harry stopped in front of a door he'd never noticed before. The wood was darker than the rest, inlaid with silver that had tarnished to black with age. During the massive cleaning effort led by Mrs. Weasley, this entire floor had been declared structurally unsound, off-limits to everyone. But now, standing here with his hand inches from the handle, Harry could feel the thrum of fresh magic in the air, wards that sang with recent use. The muttering stopped. "Kreacher?" Harry called softly. A sharp crack echoed through the hallway, and the house elf appeared before him, his tennis ball green eyes wide, with something that looked almost like relief. "Young Master Potter," Kreacher said, his voice steadier than Harry had ever heard it. "Kreacher has been waiting and preparing, as Master Regulus commanded." Regulus? Harry's throat felt dry. He remembered Sirius's brother vaguely from the family tree tapestry, another black lost to darkness, or so the story went. What does he have to do with anything? Kreacher's ears twitched, and his gnarled hands twisted together. Master Regulus left orders, specific orders, for if something happened to the Potter family. The elf's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He knew it would come to this. He saw what the old man was planning. What old man? But even as Harry asked, dread was pooling in his stomach like ice water. He already knew. Master Regulus said. Kreacher's voice cracked with the weight of 16 years of keeping secrets. Master Regulus said that if James and Lily Potter died, if their son came to this house, then Kreacher must show him the truth. All of it. Harry stared at the door, at the silver inlay that seemed to pulse with its own dim light. His hand was shaking as he reached for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The lock held firm, though he could see no keyhole, no obvious mechanism keeping it sealed. Not yet, Kreacher said quickly, placing himself between Harry and the door. Not yet, young master. The memories must be prepared properly, or the truth will be overwhelming. What memories? Harry's voice came out rougher than he intended. Kreacher. What the hell is behind that door? For a moment, Kreacher just stared at him, with those enormous eyes that had seen too much, carried too many secrets for too many years. Then his shoulders sagged, as if a weight he'd been carrying since before Harry was born was finally shifting. Master Regulus discovered things, the elf said simply. Terrible things about the man everyone trusted, about the choices he made and the prices he was willing to pay, about your parents, young Master Potter, and why they had to die for his plans to work. The hallway seemed to tilt around Harry. He pressed his palm against the wall to steady himself, the wallpaper rough and cold under his skin. That's impossible. Dumbledore tried to protect them. Did he? Kreacher's question cut through Harry's protest like a blade. Or did he simply allow young Master Potter to believe that, because the truth would have been too much to bear? Harry's breath was coming in short, sharp bursts. The logical part of his mind, the part that sounded suspiciously like Hermione, was insisting that this was impossible, that Kreacher was still mad, still consumed by the Black family's ancient prejudices. But the cold, empty space where his trust in Dumbledore used to live was whispering something else entirely. Show me, he said. Kreacher shook his head. The memories must be prepared, as Master Regulus instructed. Tonight, young master, when the others are asleep and cannot interfere. Then Kreacher will show young Master Potter what old Regulus knew. The house elf disappeared with another sharp crack, leaving Harry alone in the hallway with nothing but questions and the terrible certainty that his world was about to change again. From downstairs, he could hear Remus and Tonks talking in low voices, their words indistinct but their tones familiar and safe. Normal. Harry closed his eyes and tried to hold on to that normalcy for just a moment longer, because he had the sinking feeling it would be the last time anything felt simple again. When he opened his eyes, the door was exactly as it had been, locked, watching, waiting. But now Harry could swear he heard something from the other side. Not voices exactly, but something like an echo, a memory of a memory, preserved in silver and shadow, and the desperate love of a house elf who had spent 16 years keeping faith with a dead man's final orders. Tonight, then. Tonight he would learn what Regulus Black had discovered about Albus Dumbledore, and why the truth had been worth hiding behind blood and pain and 16 years of silence. Harry turned and walked back toward the stairs, toward the sound of familiar voices and borrowed comfort, toward what might be the last few hours of believing that the man he'd trusted with his life had actually deserved that trust. Behind him, the door remained closed, but the magic thrumming through its wood seemed almost like a heartbeat now, patient, persistent, alive with secrets that refused to stay buried any longer. Chapter 2. The Weight of Memory. The clock in the entrance hall chimed midnight, its deep bronze notes echoing through the silent corridors of Grimmauld Place. Harry had spent the evening pretending to listen as Remus and Tonks discussed safe houses and patrol schedules, nodding at appropriate intervals while his mind circled endlessly around Kreacher's words. Master Regulus said that if James and Lily Potter died, if their son came to this house, then Kreacher must show him the truth, now. As the house settled into the heavy quiet that only came after midnight, Harry slipped from his bedroom and made his way back to the 3rd floor. His bare feet made no sound on the worn carpet, but each step felt thunderously loud in the stillness. The locked door waited for him, exactly as he'd left it, silver inlay gleaming faintly in the wand light. "Kreacher," he whispered. The house elf appeared instantly, as if he'd been waiting just out of sight. In the dim light, his tennis ball eyes seemed larger, more solemn than Harry had ever seen them. "Young Master Potter is ready?" Kreacher asked quietly. Harry wasn't sure he'd ever be ready for whatever lay beyond that door, but he nodded anyway. Kreacher placed one gnarled finger against the silver inlay, and Harry heard the soft click of ancient magic, recognizing its keeper. The door swung open with barely a whisper. The room beyond took Harry's breath away. It was a study, clearly, but unlike any he'd ever seen. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, their leather bindings unmarked by the dust and decay that plagued the rest of the house. Star charts covered the ceiling, moving slowly in patterns that made Harry's eyes water if he looked too long. And everywhere, on every surface, hanging from the walls, floating in mid-air, were photographs and documents, connected by thin silver threads that formed an intricate web of information. "Master Regulus's private study," Kreacher said reverently. "Hidden from the family, hidden from the Dark Lord, hidden from everyone except Kreacher." Harry stepped inside, feeling the magic of the room settle around him like a living thing. The air here was different, cleaner somehow, charged with purpose. How long was he working on whatever this is? 3 years, Kreacher replied, moving to light candles that sprang to life with warm, steady flames. "From the time he took the dark mark until—" the elf's voice caught slightly, "until he understood what it would cost to stop both sides of the war." The photographs drew Harry's attention like magnets. He recognized some faces, his parents, young and laughing in what looked like their Hogwarts graduation photo. Dumbledore, though younger than Harry had ever seen him, standing with a tall, fair-haired wizard who made Harry's skin crawl for reasons he couldn't name. Others were strangers, austere-looking wizards in expensive robes, ministry officials from decades past, even what looked like a group of house elves gathered in some sort of formal assembly. What was he investigating? Harry asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Instead of answering directly, Kreacher moved to the far wall, where a painting of the Black family coat of arms hung in an ornate frame. With careful fingers, the elf pressed against one of the silver stars, and the painting swung aside to reveal an alcove Harry hadn't noticed. Inside, sitting on a pedestal of black marble, was a pensieve. But this wasn't the delicate, shallow basin Harry remembered from Dumbledore's office. This pensieve was ancient, carved from what looked like a single piece of obsidian, its rim etched with runes that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. The silver substance within moved sluggishly, as if it had been waiting for years to share its burden. "The Black family pensieve," Kreacher said softly. "Unchanged for 6 centuries, used by Master Regulus to preserve the most dangerous truths." He turned to face Harry, his expression grave. "Master Regulus left specific instructions. If James and Lily Potter died, if their son came to this house seeking answers, then Kreacher was to show him these memories. All of them." Harry stared at the pensieve, his mouth dry. Why me specifically? Why did he think I'd need to see this? "Because Master Regulus understood something that others did not," Kreacher replied, He understood that the war was not truly between the Dark Lord and the Light. It was between those who would use power for their own ends, no matter the cost. The elf's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and he understood that Albus Dumbledore was willing to sacrifice anyone, even the Potter family, to win. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his hand catching the edge of a desk to keep himself upright. That's impossible. Dumbledore tried to protect them. Did he? Kreacher's interruption was gentle but implacable. Or did he allow young Master Potter to believe that? Because the truth was too terrible to bear. Harry wanted to argue, to defend the man who had been his mentor, his guide through the impossible maze of the wizarding world. But the doubts that had been growing since Dumbledore's death, since Snape's betrayal, since learning that he was meant to die, suddenly felt much heavier, much more real. "Show me," he said, the words scraping against his throat like broken glass. Kreacher nodded solemnly and moved to the pensive. Master Regulus began his investigation when he first suspected that neither side of this war was what it appeared to be. The first memory is from early 1978, 6 months after he took the Dark Mark. With practiced movements, Kreacher drew a silvery strand from the pensive and let it fall back into the basin. The memory swirled, forming shapes and colors that resolved into a scene Harry recognized. The drawing room of this very house, though cleaner and more opulent than he'd ever seen it. Master Regulus was arguing with his cousin, Bellatrix, Kreacher explained. She had come to congratulate him on joining the Dark Lord's cause. Harry leaned forward, drawn despite himself into the memory's pool. He could see 2 figures now, a young man who looked so much like Sirius it made Harry's chest ache, and a younger version of Bellatrix Lestrange, beautiful and terrible and completely mad even then. "Watch closely, young Master Potter," Kreacher whispered. This is where Master Regulus first began to understand the true nature of the game being played. Harry hesitated for a moment longer, his hands gripping the edge of the pensive so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Once he entered this memory, once he saw whatever truth Regulus Black had died to preserve, there would be no going back. No more comforting lies. No more faith in the man who had shaped his entire understanding of right and wrong. But the alternative was continuing to live in ignorance while the war raged around him, continuing to be a pawn in someone else's game without even knowing it. Harry closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and plunged his face into the swirling silver. The world dissolved around him, replaced by the familiar sensation of falling through memory and time. When it reformed, he was standing in the drawing room of Grimmauld Place, as it had been nearly 20 years ago. The furniture was pristine, the wallpaper rich and unmarked by time, and the portraits that now hung silent and dusty were alive with movement and whispered conversation. 2 people sat by the fire, their voices low but intense enough to carry clearly through the room. "You think too much, Regulus," Bellatrix was saying, her voice already carrying the edge of madness that would eventually consume her completely. "The Dark Lord offers power beyond imagination, and you waste time questioning his methods." "I question everyone's methods," the younger Regulus replied coolly. "That includes Dumbledore's." Bellatrix laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Dumbledore? What has that old fool got to do with anything?" "Everything," Regulus said quietly. "Think about it, Bella. How convenient that the prophecy about a child who could defeat the Dark Lord was overheard by someone we all know has ties to Dumbledore. How convenient that said child has been kept isolated from our world, raised by muggles who despise magic." He leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. How convenient that this supposed weapon against darkness has been shaped by suffering and abandonment into exactly the sort of martyr Dumbledore needs. "You're talking nonsense," Bellatrix snapped, but Harry could see uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Am I?" Regulus stood and began pacing before the fire. "I've been watching, Bella. listening. Both sides of this war are being manipulated by men who believe that any sacrifice is acceptable for their version of the greater good. The Dark Lord destroys those who oppose him. Dumbledore destroys those who trust him. The only difference is that one is honest about his cruelty. Harry felt the memory begin to fade around him, pulling him back to the present with a sensation like surfacing from deep water. When the study reformed around him, he found himself gasping, his heart racing as if he'd been running. Kreacher was watching him carefully, those enormous eyes filled with something that might have been pity. "That was only the beginning," the elf said softly. "Master Regulus spent 3 years gathering proof of what he suspected that night. 3 years learning that both the Dark Lord and Albus Dumbledore were willing to sacrifice anyone, including the Potter family, to achieve their goals." Harry stared into the pensive, where dozens more memories swirled like silver smoke, each one containing another piece of the truth that Regulus Black had died protecting. His hands were shaking, and he realized that some fundamental part of his world, the part that had trusted blindly in Dumbledore's wisdom and goodness, had already begun to crack. "How many more?" he asked. "Enough," Kreacher replied simply. "Enough to understand why Master Regulus chose to defy them both, and enough to understand why he knew that someday the Potter boy would need to make the same choice." Chapter 3. The Prophecy's Shadow. Harry stared into the swirling silver of the pensive, his mind reeling from what he'd already seen. Regulus arguing with Bellatrix about blind trust, about convenient prophecies, and manipulated children. The words echoed in his head like a drumbeat. How convenient that this supposed weapon against darkness has been shaped by suffering and abandonment into exactly the sort of martyr Dumbledore needs. "There are more memories, aren't there?" Harry asked, though he already knew the answer from the way the silver substance continued to churn with unviewed scenes. Kreacher nodded solemnly. "Master Regulus was very thorough in his investigations. The next memory is from the summer of 1980, shortly after the prophecy was first heard." The house elf's voice dropped lower, more reverent. Master Regulus had begun following Dumbledore, using magic the old man never suspected. What he overheard that night, it changed everything. With careful movements, Kreacher extracted another strand of memory, this one glowing with an almost sickly pale light. As it fell back into the pensive, the silver surface showed glimpses of a familiar office, Dumbledore's study at Hogwarts, though somehow starker than Harry remembered it. "Watch carefully, young Master Potter," Kreacher whispered. "This is where Master Regulus learned that Albus Dumbledore had been planning your parents' death from the very beginning." Harry's stomach lurched, but he forced himself to lean forward into the memory's pull. The world dissolved again, and when it reformed, he was standing in Dumbledore's office on what appeared to be a summer evening. The setting sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, and the portraits of former headmasters dozed peacefully in their frames. 2 figures sat before the desk, Dumbledore himself, looking younger but already wearing the weight of terrible knowledge in his lined face, and Professor McGonagall, her hair more black than grey, her expression troubled. "I still don't understand why we cannot simply relocate the Potter family," McGonagall was saying, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Somewhere far from Britain, where Voldemort's reach cannot extend. The prophecy speaks of a child born as the 7th month dies. It says nothing about that child remaining in the country of his birth." Dumbledore's fingers were steepled before his face, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of infinite sadness that Harry had heard countless times before. "Because, Minerva, the prophecy is not the end of our story. It is merely the beginning. If Harry Potter is to fulfill his ultimate purpose, he must be forged by specific experiences." "His ultimate purpose?" McGonagall's voice rose slightly. "Albus, he is a baby. His purpose should be to grow up safely, to have a childhood, to die at precisely the right moment for precisely the right cause," Dumbledore interrupted quietly. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of horror that Harry could feel even as a memory observer. The magic that will save our world requires a willing sacrifice, Minerva. Harry must choose death to save others, just as his mother chose death to save him. But such a choice cannot be made by a boy who has known only love and safety. Harry's legs gave out. He stumbled backward in the memory space, his hands clutching at nothing as the full implication of Dumbledore's words crashed over him. The man he had trusted, the man he had looked up to as a grandfather figure, had been planning his death from the moment he was born. "No," McGonagall whispered, echoing Harry's own thoughts. "No, Albus, you cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what you think I mean," Dumbledore said, and his voice was gentle in the way that Harry now realized meant immovable determination. Harry Potter must be placed with relatives who will ensure he grows up unloved, unwanted, desperate for any scrap of affection or belonging. When the time comes for him to choose between his own life and the lives of others, he must choose others. A boy who has been cherished would hesitate. A boy who has never known his own worth will not. The memory began to fade, pulling Harry back to the present with a violence that left him gasping on the floor of Regulus's study. His chest felt tight, compressed, as if all the air had been squeezed from the room. Dimly, he was aware of Kreacher moving around him, lighting more candles, muttering words of comfort that Harry couldn't quite process. "Master Regulus suspected from the beginning," the house elf said softly. But it was not until he heard those words that he understood the true scope of Dumbledore's manipulation. "There's more," Harry managed to whisper. It wasn't a question. Kreacher nodded gravely. "The next memory is from several months later. Master Regulus had begun watching Severus Snape, wondering how Dumbledore had managed to turn a devoted Death Eater into his most loyal servant." The second memory strand gleamed like tarnished silver as Kreacher drew it from the pensive. Harry forced himself to stand, to lean forward again, despite every instinct screaming at him to run, to flee, to never learn another terrible truth about the man who had shaped his entire world. This memory formed into a scene Harry didn't recognize, a small, dimly lit room that might have been a tavern's private parlor. Snow fell beyond grimy windows, and the fire in the grate cast more shadows than light. Two figures sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table, Dumbledore and a younger Severus Snape, whose face was streaked with tears. "She's gone," Snape was saying, his voice raw with grief that Harry had never heard before, even in his worst memories of the potions master. "Lily is gone, and it's my fault. I told him about the prophecy, and now, yes," Dumbledore agreed simply, "it is your fault." The blunt cruelty of the words hit Harry like a slap. He had expected Dumbledore to offer comfort, reassurance, the gentle wisdom he had always provided Harry in moments of crisis. Instead, the headmaster sat calmly, while Snape crumbled before his eyes. "But," Dumbledore continued, his voice taking on that familiar tone of gentle manipulation that Harry was only now learning to recognize, "perhaps some good can come from this tragedy. Lily Potter died to save her son, creating magic powerful enough to destroy Voldemort himself. The question now is whether you will honor her sacrifice by helping me ensure that magic is used properly." "What do you mean?" Snape whispered. "I mean that Harry Potter will need guidance, Severus. He will need to be shaped and prepared for the task ahead of him. You, who loved his mother, who understand the weight of sacrifice better than anyone, you could be instrumental in ensuring he becomes the weapon we need him to be." Harry watched in growing horror as understanding dawned in Snape's red-rimmed eyes. "You want me to spy on Voldemort for you?" "I want you to help me save the world," Dumbledore corrected gently. "Harry Potter must die to defeat Voldemort. That is unavoidable. But he must die willingly, nobly, in full understanding of what his sacrifice means. You could help ensure he reaches that understanding. And in return? Snape's voice was barely audible. In return, you spend the rest of your life serving the memory of the woman you loved. Every day you protect her son, you honor her sacrifice. Every day you prepare him for his own death, you ensure her death was not in vain. The memory dissolved again, leaving Harry on his knees in Regulus's study, bile rising in his throat. The manipulation was so complete, so perfectly crafted to use Snape's grief and guilt as chains, that Harry could barely comprehend it. Dumbledore had taken a man destroyed by loss and rebuilt him as an instrument of Harry's eventual destruction. One more, Kreacher said quietly. The most important one, from the autumn of 1981, just before your parents went into hiding. Harry wanted to refuse, wanted to cover his ears and close his eyes and pretend he had never entered this room, never learned these terrible truths, but the third memory was already forming in the pensive, and some desperate part of him needed to know the full extent of what had been done to his family. This memory showed the same tavern room, but the season had changed to autumn. Dead leaves pressed against the windows, and the fire burned lower, casting the room in deeper shadow. Dumbledore sat alone at the table, examining a collection of papers spread before him. A moment later, another figure entered, a wizard Harry didn't recognize, middle-aged and nervous. "You sent for me, Headmaster?" the stranger said. "Indeed, Wilkins. I trust you have the information I requested about alternative protection methods for the Potter family." The man called Wilkins nodded eagerly, pulling out a thick scroll. "Yes, sir. I've researched every option available. We could establish a safe house in the Americas using blood ward anchoring, or perhaps a Fidelius charm with multiple secret keepers, making betrayal nearly impossible. There's even a technique developed in India that could render them completely untrackable by any dark magic." Dumbledore listened patiently, nodding at appropriate intervals. When Wilkins finished his presentation, the headmaster gathered the papers carefully. "Excellent work," Dumbledore said warmly. "Most thorough." "Which option would you prefer to implement, sir?" Wilkins asked eagerly. "None of them," Dumbledore replied calmly, and began feeding the papers into the fire. "The Potter family will remain exactly where they are, protected only by the Fidelius charm as originally planned." Wilkins's face went white. "Sir, with respect, Peter Pettigrew is not the most reliable choice for secret keeper. My research suggests significant character flaws that could lead to betrayal, yes," Dumbledore agreed, still feeding papers to the flames. "That is, in fact, the point." The memory ended abruptly, snapping Harry back to the present with such force that he actually cried out. He found himself curled on the floor, his whole body shaking with rage and horror, and a grief so deep it felt like drowning. Dumbledore had known. He had known Pettigrew would betray his parents, had known they would die, had actively prevented their salvation, because their deaths were necessary for his plans. Master Regulus saw the puppet strings. "Young Master Potter," Kreacher said softly, kneeling beside Harry's shaking form. He saw how Dumbledore pulled them all. Your parents, Severus Snape, even you yourself. And he understood that the only way to break free was to cut the strings entirely. Harry pressed his face against the cold floor, unable to speak, unable to think beyond the devastating revelation that everything, every loss, every moment of suffering, every terrible choice he'd been forced to make, had been orchestrated by the man he'd trusted most. When he finally looked up, Kreacher was watching him with those enormous eyes, filled with something that might have been compassion. "Why?" Harry whispered. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because Master Regulus left instructions," Kreacher replied simply. "And because you deserve to know that you were never meant to be a weapon in someone else's war. You were always meant to be Harry Potter. Nothing more, nothing less, and nothing that required your parents to die for Dumbledore's greater good." Chapter 4. The Network of Lies. Harry remained on the floor of Regulus's study for what felt like hours, though the candles burning around him suggested only minutes had passed. His mind felt fractured, split between the boy who had worshipped Albus Dumbledore and the young man who was beginning to understand the scope of his manipulation. Every memory he'd just witnessed played on endless repeat. Dumbledore planning his death from birth, using Snape's grief as a weapon, actively preventing his parents' protection. "There are more, aren't there?" Harry finally asked, his voice hoarse. Kreacher nodded solemnly from where he sat beside the pensive, his gnarled hands folded in his lap. Master Regulus was very thorough, young Master Potter. He understood that to defeat such a manipulative mind, he needed irrefutable proof of every crime. With effort that felt monumental, Harry pushed himself to his feet. His legs shook, but he managed to stand upright, gripping the edge of the pensive for support. "Show me the rest." "These next memories," Kreacher warned gently. "They concern your childhood directly. Master Regulus gathered them through unconventional means. The house elf network sees much that wizards prefer to ignore." The first memory strand that Kreacher extracted gleamed with a sickly yellow light. As it swirled in the pensive, Harry caught glimpses of a familiar suburban street, Privet Drive, though somehow more pristine than he remembered it. "This memory comes from November of 1981, Kreacher explained, 3 days after you were placed with your relatives. Master Regulus had instructed the house elves of several prominent families to observe and report on your welfare." Harry leaned into the memory, and the world reformed around him into the Dursley living room. But this wasn't the cramped, television-dominated space he remembered from his childhood. This room was neat, expectant, with a bassinet sitting prominently near the fireplace, where a baby, himself, slept fitfully. 2 figures stood in the center of the room, Dumbledore, looking every inch the benevolent grandfather, and Vernon Dursley, red-faced and bellowing. "Told you people we wanted nothing to do with your lot," Vernon was shouting. "We're decent, normal folk. We don't want anything to do with freaks and weirdos." "And yet," Dumbledore replied calmly, "Harry must remain here. The blood protection requires it." "Then find somewhere else." Petunia's voice came from the doorway, sharp with barely controlled hysteria. "We never wanted children, especially not," she gestured violently at the bassinet, "not freaks like my sister." Harry watched in growing horror as understanding dawned in Dumbledore's ancient eyes, not shock or disappointment, but satisfaction. "I see," the headmaster said quietly. "You find the child burdensome." "We find the child unacceptable," Vernon spat. "Magical nonsense aside, we never agreed to take in someone else's brat." Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their words carefully. "Perhaps we could reach a compromise. Harry will require very little. A cupboard for sleeping, the most basic of meals, minimal interaction. Think of him less as a child to raise and more as a necessary inconvenience. The protection his mother's sacrifice provides will keep him alive. Nothing more is required." The memory dissolved, leaving Harry gasping in Regulus's study. The casual way Dumbledore had discussed his childhood suffering, a cupboard for sleeping, as if it were simply another variable to be managed in his grand design. "He knew," Harry whispered. "From the very beginning, he knew they would." "He planned for it," Kreacher corrected gently. "The next memory will show you how deliberately." This memory strand was darker, tinged with green that made Harry's skin crawl. The scene that formed was Dumbledore's office, but the timeline had clearly advanced. The headmaster looked older, more careworn, and snow fell heavily outside the windows. A small, dumpy woman sat across from Dumbledore's desk, clutching a teacup with hands that shook slightly. Harry recognized her immediately, Mrs. Figg, his squib babysitter from Privet Drive. "The boy grows thinner each year, Albus," Mrs. Figg was saying, her voice tight with concern. "The Dursleys barely feed him, and when they do, it's scraps. He told me yesterday that his cousin gets 2 bedrooms while he sleeps in a cupboard under the stairs." "I see," Dumbledore replied, making a note on a piece of parchment. "And his magical displays? Any accidental magic?" Increasing in frequency and intensity, Mrs. Figg confirmed. Last week he turned his teacher's wig blue after she embarrassed him in class. The week before, he somehow got onto the roof of his primary school when Dudley's gang was chasing him. "Excellent," Dumbledore murmured, and Harry's blood turned to ice at the satisfaction in the old man's voice. "The more desperate he becomes, the more his magic will respond to protect him. This will serve us well when the time comes." "Albus," Mrs. Figg said hesitantly. "Perhaps if I reported the abuse to the proper authorities, the boy could be placed somewhere more suitable." "Absolutely not." Dumbledore's voice cut like a blade through her suggestion. "Harry must remain with his blood relatives for the protection to hold. Any intervention by Muggle authorities would compromise that protection entirely." "But surely there are other options." "Arabella," Dumbledore interrupted, his voice taking on that gentle, implacable tone that Harry now recognized as pure manipulation. "Harry Potter's suffering is unfortunate, yes, but it is also necessary. A boy who has known only love and safety cannot be expected to sacrifice his life for others when the moment comes. A boy who has never known his own worth, however—" He spread his hands in a gesture that suggested inevitable logic. Mrs. Figg's teacup rattled against its saucer. "You want him to grow up feeling worthless." "I want him to grow up capable of the ultimate sacrifice," Dumbledore corrected. "His mother died to save him. When the time comes, he must be willing to die to save others. The magic requires it." The memory faded, leaving Harry shaking with rage so pure it felt like lightning in his veins. Every beating, every hungry night, every moment of isolation and degradation, all of it had been part of Dumbledore's design. "Master Regulus was horrified when he learned of this conversation," Kreacher said quietly. "He had hoped the placement with your relatives was simply a necessary evil. To discover it was a calculated cruelty." "There's more," Harry said. It wasn't a question. He could see other memory strands waiting in the pensive, each one promising fresh revelations of betrayal. Kreacher extracted a memory that shimmered like oil on water, dark and iridescent and wrong. "This memory is from the summer you turned 5. Master Regulus had begun tracking all the offers of assistance that reached Dumbledore regarding your welfare. The scene that formed was again Dumbledore's office, but this time the headmaster was not alone. A tall, distinguished wizard with silver hair and expensive robes stood before the desk, his expression earnest and concerned. "Headmaster Dumbledore," the man was saying, "the House of Bones formally requests permission to assume guardianship of young Harry Potter. My niece Amelia has thoroughly investigated the boy's current living situation, and what we've discovered is disturbing." "Lord Bones," Dumbledore replied warmly, "how thoughtful of your family to show such concern." "It goes beyond concern," Lord Bones insisted. "The child is being systematically abused. Amelia's contacts in the Muggle world confirm that he's malnourished, isolated, and showing signs of magical trauma. We can provide him with a loving home, proper magical education, and completely undermine the protection his mother's sacrifice provides," Dumbledore finished gently. "I'm afraid that's impossible." Lord Bones's face darkened. "Then perhaps the House of Longbottom? Augusta has expressed similar concerns, as have the Abbotts, the Macmillans, even—" He paused, lowering his voice. "Even Narcissa Malfoy has inquired about alternative arrangements." Harry's breath caught. Multiple pure-blood families had tried to rescue him from the Dursleys, families who could have given him the magical childhood he'd dreamed of during those long, hungry nights in his cupboard. "All generous offers," Dumbledore agreed, "and all impossible to accept. Harry must remain where he is." "Why?" Lord Bones demanded. "What possible reason?" "Because," Dumbledore replied, his voice taking on that terrible gentleness again, "Harry Potter's greatest strength will come from his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. A boy raised in luxury, surrounded by love and admiration, cannot develop that willingness. But a boy who has never known his own value, who believes himself to be nothing special? He smiled, and Harry wanted to vomit at the kindness in it. Such a boy will give his life gladly when the time comes. The memory shattered around Harry like broken glass, leaving him standing in the study with tears of rage streaming down his face. Not just one family, multiple families had tried to save him, had tried to give him a real life, a magical education, parents who would love him. And Dumbledore had turned them all away to preserve Harry's suffering. "How many?" Harry asked through gritted teeth. "How many families offered?" 13, Kreacher replied simply. Master Regulus documented them all. The houses of Bones, Longbottom, Abbott, Macmillan, even some who had initially supported the Dark Lord, but recoiled from Dumbledore's methods. All turned away, so that you would remain hungry and desperate and worthless in your own eyes. The rage that filled Harry then was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the hot fury of a teenager denied what he wanted. It was the cold, calculating anger of someone who finally understood how completely he had been betrayed. Every scar from Dudley's fists, every night he'd gone to bed hungry, every moment he'd believed himself to be a freak who deserved his treatment. All of it had been orchestrated by the man who had claimed to love him. "There is one more memory," Kreacher said hesitantly. Master Regulus confronting Professor Snape about his role in this manipulation. It was difficult for Master Regulus to watch. The final memory strand gleamed like spun silver, but Harry could see darkness threaded through it like veins of poison. The scene it showed was the same tavern room where Dumbledore had first manipulated Snape's grief, but this time only two figures sat at the scarred wooden table. Regulus Black and a young Severus Snape. "You know what he's doing to the Potter boy," Regulus was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You've seen the reports from Mrs. Figg. You know about the families he's turned away. How can you continue to serve him?" Snape's face was a mask of pain and stubbornness. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Regulus slammed his hand on the table. "You think you are honoring Lily Evans' memory by ensuring her son suffers exactly as Dumbledore planned. You think your guilt over her death justifies participating in her child's systematic abuse?" "It's not abuse," Snape said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's preparation." "Preparation for what? For suicide?" Regulus leaned forward, his grey eyes blazing. "Severus, listen to yourself. You're helping to torture a child because you believe it will make him more willing to die when Dumbledore demands it." For a moment, something shifted in Snape's expression. Doubt, horror, the beginning of understanding. But then his features hardened again, resuming the familiar mask of cold indifference. "Lily died for him," Snape said quietly. "The least I can do is ensure her sacrifice means something." "Her sacrifice already meant something." Regulus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "She saved her son's life, but Dumbledore has twisted that salvation into something ugly, something that requires the boy to suffer as payment for his mother's love." Snape remained seated, staring at his hands. "I have made my choice." "Then you've chosen wrong," Regulus replied simply. "And when the truth comes out, and it will come out, Severus, history will remember you as the man who helped destroy the child you claimed to protect in his mother's memory." The memory ended abruptly, pulling Harry back to the present with enough force to leave him breathless. He stood in Regulus's study, surrounded by proof of a conspiracy so vast and intricate that it encompassed every aspect of his life, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The last vestiges of his faith in Albus Dumbledore crumbled away like ash, leaving behind something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Master Regulus spent 6 months gathering all this evidence," Kreacher said softly. "He knew that when the time came, you would need to understand the full scope of what had been done to you." Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, surprised to find his tears had stopped. The grief and shock were still there, but they had been joined by something else, a crystalline clarity that cut through years of confusion and self-doubt. "He left instructions," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, young Master Potter," Kreacher confirmed. "Instructions for what to do when you finally learned the truth. Instructions for how to take back the life that was stolen from you." For the first time since entering this room, Harry smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Then show me." Chapter 5. The True Secret Keeper. The silence in Regulus's study stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft whisper of candle flames and Harry's ragged breathing. He stood before the pensive with his hands clenched into fists, the revelations of the past hours settling into his bones like poison. Everything he had believed about his life, his childhood, his very existence, all of it had been carefully orchestrated lies. But there was one more memory. Harry could see it swirling in the depths of the pensive like a malignant star, darker than all the others, pulsing with a grief so profound it seemed to have weight. "This is the final memory," Kreacher said quietly, his ancient voice heavy with sorrow. "Master Regulus called it the most important and the most terrible. It concerns the night your parents died, young Master Potter." Harry's throat constricted. "The night Pettigrew betrayed them." "Yes," Kreacher confirmed, "but not in the way you have been told. This memory will show you that Peter Pettigrew was not the true architect of your parents' death. He was merely the instrument." With trembling fingers, Kreacher extracted the final strand from the pensive. It gleamed like liquid shadow, and as it fell back into the basin, Harry caught glimpses of scenes that made his stomach lurch. Familiar faces twisted with fear, green light, and through it all, the terrible calm of a man watching his plans unfold exactly as intended. "Master Regulus obtained this memory at great personal risk," Kreacher explained. "He had to use magic that nearly killed him, magic that allowed him to witness events from afar through unconventional means. What he saw that night drove him to make his final, desperate choice." Harry stared into the swirling memory, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Part of him wanted to run, to flee this room and these terrible truths and pretend he had never learned them. But the larger part, the part that had suffered through 16 years of manipulation, needed to know. "Show me," he whispered. The world dissolved, and when it reformed, Harry found himself standing in a place he had never seen, but somehow recognized from countless nightmares. The sitting room of the cottage in Godric's Hollow. It was October 31st, 1981, and the room was warm with firelight and the sound of a baby's laughter. But Harry's attention was drawn immediately to the two figures hunched over a crystal ball in the corner of the room. The ball showed not the cottage's interior, but Dumbledore's office at Hogwarts, where the headmaster sat behind his desk, reading correspondence with the same calm attention he might give to lesson plans. "Message came through an hour ago," a tense voice was saying from the crystal. Harry turned to see a younger Kingsley Shacklebolt speaking urgently to someone outside the viewing sphere. "Pettigrew's been spotted meeting with known Death Eaters. Our source in the Ministry confirms he's been feeding information to you-know-who for weeks." In the crystal, Dumbledore set down his parchment with careful precision. "I see. And when did this intelligence reach the Ministry?" "This morning, sir. Aura Moody wants to move the Potters immediately. He says—" "Thank you, Kingsley," Dumbledore interrupted gently. "That will be all." The crystal went dark, leaving the cottage in firelit silence. Harry watched in growing horror as understanding began to dawn. Dumbledore had known. Hours before Voldemort's arrival, he had known that Pettigrew would betray the Potters, and he had done nothing. The scene shifted, and Harry found himself observing the same office from a different angle. This time, Dumbledore was not alone. A house elf Harry didn't recognize cowered before the great desk, wringing its hands as it spoke. "Master Dumbledore, sir," Kreacher of the House of Black sends urgent word. The Dark Lord is moving tonight, sir. He knows where the Potter family hides." Dumbledore's expression remained perfectly serene. "Indeed? And how does young Regulus come by this information?" "Master Regulus has been watching the secret keeper, sir. Peter Pettigrew met with Death Eaters not 2 hours past. He told them everything, sir. Everything." "I see." Dumbledore rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. "Thank you for bringing me this information. Please tell Regulus that his vigilance is noted." The house elf disappeared with a sharp crack, leaving Dumbledore alone. For long moments, the headmaster simply stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Then, with movements that seemed almost ritualistic, he began gathering certain items from his office: his traveling cloak, a small bag, several official-looking documents. "Where are you going, Albus?" The voice came from one of the portrait frames, an elderly wizard with a concerned expression. "Away," Dumbledore replied simply. "There are matters that require my urgent attention in London. I shall return tomorrow." "But the Potters," another portrait began. "The Potters are as safe as they can possibly be," Dumbledore said, and there was something final in his tone that silenced all further questions. Some things must unfold as they are meant to unfold. The memory shifted again, and Harry found himself back in the cottage's sitting room. But now the atmosphere had changed completely. The warmth was gone, replaced by a creeping chill that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. James Potter sat in an armchair near the fire, his dark hair dishevelled, his face drawn with exhaustion and growing fear. "Something's wrong," James was saying to his wife, who sat nursing baby Harry by the window. "I can feel it, Lily. Something's very wrong." Lily Evans Potter looked up from their son, her green eyes, so like Harry's own, filled with the same unease. "The wards are holding. Dumbledore said they would hold as long as Peter keeps our secret," James finished grimly. "But what if he doesn't? What if something's happened to him?" "Don't," Lily whispered, clutching baby Harry closer to her chest. "Don't even think it. Peter would never." The sound that interrupted her was not the crash of splintering wood or the thunder of dark magic, but something far more chilling, a soft, polite knock at the front door. James was on his feet instantly, his wand in his hand. Who could it be? No one should be able to find us. Another knock, patient and courteous. Then a voice, high and cold and terrifyingly familiar, speaking through the door with grotesque politeness. "James Potter. Lily Potter. I have come for your son. Open the door, and I will make your deaths swift." The colour drained from James's face. How did he—" "Peter," Lily breathed, and Harry could hear his mother's heart breaking in that single word. "Oh, Peter, what have you done?" What followed was burned into Harry's memory from years of Dementor-induced nightmares, but seeing it happen, actually witnessing his father's desperate last stand, his mother's final moments of love and terror, nearly broke something fundamental inside him. He watched James Potter die with his wand in his hand, trying to buy his family time that would never come. He watched Lily Potter die pleading for her son's life, her love creating magic so profound it would burn through the darkest curse ever conceived. But what destroyed Harry completely was what came after. The scene shifted one final time, showing Dumbledore's office in the early hours of November 1st. The headmaster sat behind his desk, perfectly groomed despite the late hour, reading reports of the night's events with the same calm attention he had shown the intelligence about Pettigrew's betrayal. A younger McGonagall burst through the office doors without knocking, her face streaked with tears and ash from the destroyed cottage. "Albus!" she cried. "James and Lily are dead. Voldemort found them somehow and—" "Yes," Dumbledore replied quietly, not looking up from his reports. "I heard." McGonagall stared at him in horror. "You heard. That's all you can say? They're dead, Albus. The Potters are dead, and their son is orphaned. And you—" "I know exactly what has happened, Minerva," Dumbledore interrupted, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. "Just as I knew what was going to happen when I received word of Pettigrew's betrayal yesterday evening." The silence that followed was absolute. McGonagall's face went white as understanding dawned. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew Peter had betrayed them, and you did nothing." "I did exactly what was necessary," Dumbledore corrected gently. "Lily Potter's sacrifice has created magic more powerful than anything Voldemort has ever encountered. Her son now carries protection that will shield him until he comes of age. And when that protection fades..." He spread his hands in a gesture that encompassed vast, terrible plans. "When it fades, Harry Potter will be ready to complete the sacrifice his mother began." "You let them die," McGonagall said, and her voice was hollow with shock. "You let James and Lily die, so you could use their son as a weapon. I allowed events to unfold as they needed to unfold," Dumbledore replied. "The prophecy spoke of a child with the power to defeat Voldemort. It did not speak of a child who would survive that defeat. Harry Potter was always meant to die. Minerva. The only question was whether his death would serve a greater purpose." The memory shattered around Harry like breaking glass, hurling him back into Regulus's study with such violence that he collapsed to his knees, screaming. The sound that tore from his throat was not quite human. It was grief and rage and betrayal given voice, the sound of a soul breaking under the weight of ultimate betrayal. Every magical object in the room resonated with his anguish, crystal spheres chiming like funeral bells, books flying open and slamming shut, candles flaring so bright they nearly blinded him. He had known, from the moment the prophecy was spoken, that his parents would die. Had known, and had done nothing, because their deaths were necessary for his grand design. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the chosen one, the beloved savior of the wizarding world, all of it built on the foundation of his parents' orchestrated murder. "No," Harry sobbed, his hands clawing at the ancient carpet. "No, no, no!" But Kreacher was there, kneeling beside him, with tears streaming down his own weathered cheeks. "Yes, young Master Potter, the truth is terrible, but it is truth nonetheless." "He killed them," Harry gasped between sobs. "Dumbledore killed my parents as surely as if he'd cast the curse himself." "Yes," Kreacher agreed simply, and Master Regulus saw it all. Saw and understood, and began planning his own response to such unforgivable manipulation. Gradually, Harry's sobs subsided into ragged breathing. The magical objects around them settled back into silence, as if the room itself was recovering from his emotional explosion. When he finally looked up, Kreacher was watching him with something that might have been pride. "Master Regulus knew this moment would come," the house elf said softly. "He knew that someday you would learn the truth about your parents' death, and would need guidance on what to do with that knowledge." Harry wiped his eyes with shaking hands. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been joined by something else, a cold, crystalline fury that felt like ice in his veins. "He left instructions," Harry said hoarsely. "Yes, young Master Potter." Kreacher moved to a desk in the corner of the room, withdrawing a sealed envelope that gleamed with protective charms. Instructions written in his own hand, sealed with his own magic, meant for the moment when James and Lily Potter's son finally understood the depth of his betrayal. Harry struggled to his feet, accepting the envelope with hands that still trembled. His name was written across it in elegant script, and below that, words that made his breath catch. "For Harry Potter, the last victim of Albus Dumbledore's greater good. When you are ready to stop being a victim and start being a force for justice, break the seal." Harry looked up at Kreacher, and for the first time since entering this room, his voice was steady. "I'm ready." Chapter 6. The Instructions of the Dead. Harry held the sealed envelope in hands that had finally stopped shaking, staring at the elegant script that promised answers. not to questions about what had been done to him, but about what he could do in return. The grief was still there, a constant ache beneath his ribs where his heart used to be whole, but it had crystallized into something harder, something that felt remarkably like purpose. "Before you open Master Regulus's final instructions," Kreacher said quietly, "there is one more memory he left. Not a memory of others' crimes, but of his own preparations. He wanted you to understand the tools he had gathered before you learned how to use them." Harry looked up from the envelope. "Tools." Master Regulus spent his final months not just gathering evidence, but building a network, Kreacher explained, moving to the pensive with reverent care. He understood that exposing Dumbledore's crimes would require more than proof. It would require allies, resources, and most importantly, legitimacy. The memory strand that Kreacher extracted gleamed like polished silver, free from the darkness that had tainted all the others. As it settled into the pensive, Harry caught glimpses of this very room, but somehow more alive, charged with desperate purpose. "This memory is from September of 1979, Kreacher said softly, 3 weeks before Master Regulus made his final choice. He knew he might not survive his defection from the Dark Lord, so he prepared for every possibility." Harry leaned into the memory, and for the first time in hours, the world that formed around him felt hopeful rather than horrible. He was standing in Regulus's study, as it had been 18 years ago, but the room hummed with activity. House elves moved efficiently between desks laden with documents, while Regulus himself sat before a magical dictation quill, his young face set with grim determination. "If you are hearing this, Harry Potter," Regulus was saying to the quill, which scratched rapidly across a piece of parchment, "then James and Lily Potter are dead, and Albus Dumbledore's manipulation of our world has reached its intended conclusion. More importantly, it means you have discovered the truth about your circumstances and are ready to do something about it." Harry's breath caught. Even 18 years dead, Regulus Black was speaking directly to him with uncanny accuracy. "I have spent the better part of a year documenting Dumbledore's crimes," Regulus continued, "but documentation alone is insufficient. If you are to succeed in exposing him and dismantling the web of manipulation he has built around our society, you will need 3 things: irrefutable evidence, powerful allies, and unassailable legitimacy." The memory Regulus gestured, and one of the house elves approached, carrying an ornate wooden box inlaid with silver runes. "The evidence you have already seen. But what you may not realize is that much of it came from Dumbledore's own pensive." Harry's eyes widened as Regulus opened the box, revealing dozens of memory strands organized in careful rows, each one labeled with precise dates and descriptions. "House elf magic is unique," Regulus explained to his invisible audience. "We can access places and memories that are warded against wizards. Over the course of 6 months, Kreacher and his fellow elves copied every relevant memory from Dumbledore's personal collection, along with memories from key figures like Snape, McGonagall, and others who participated in his schemes, often without realizing it." The scene shifted, showing Regulus standing before a massive map of Britain with dozens of pins marking locations across the country. "As for allies," he continued, "I have identified 17 families and individuals who have either suffered under Dumbledore's manipulations or who possess the moral clarity to recognize them for what they are." Harry watched as Regulus pointed to specific pins, his voice taking on the tone of a military strategist. "Amelia Bones of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Her younger brother Edgar was killed in an Order mission that Dumbledore could have prevented with better intelligence sharing. Augusta Longbottom, her son and daughter-in-law were tortured because Dumbledore failed to act on information about Death Eater safe houses. Lord Greengrass, Lord Davis, even certain members of the Malfoy family who have grown uncomfortable with the extremism on both sides of this conflict." The memory shifted again, showing Regulus in conversation with a stern-looking witch Harry recognized as a younger version of Madame Bones. They sat in what appeared to be a ministry office, speaking in low, urgent tones. "You're certain of this intelligence, Mr. Black?" Bones was asking, reviewing a stack of documents with a horrified expression. "Absolutely certain," Regulus replied. "Dumbledore has been systematically placing his own people in key positions throughout the ministry, while simultaneously withholding crucial intelligence from the Aura Department. The deaths of your colleagues could have been prevented if he had shared what he knew." Bones set down the documents with shaking hands. "This is monstrous. If even half of what you're suggesting is true—" "All of it is true," Regulus said quietly, "and all of it is documented. The question is whether you're prepared to act when the time comes." "What time?" Bones asked. "When someone finally has the legitimacy to bring charges against him," Regulus replied. "Someone with a personal stake in seeing justice done. Someone like, for instance, the orphaned son of James and Lily Potter." The memory dissolved, returning Harry to the present study, where Kreacher watched him with knowing eyes. "Master Regulus built a network of allies who would be ready to act when you were ready to lead them," the house elf explained. "But he understood that even with evidence and allies, you would need something more, the moral authority to challenge the most respected wizard of our age." "And how exactly do I get that?" Harry asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Instead of answering directly, Kreacher moved to another section of the room, where a collection of official-looking documents lay spread across a desk. Master Regulus researched the legal precedents extensively. In cases where a wizard's actions have caused widespread harm through manipulation or negligence, the families of the victims have the right to demand a formal inquiry before the Wizengamot. Harry stared at the documents. "A trial?" "Not just any trial," Kreacher corrected. "A trial of legacy, a formal examination of whether Albus Dumbledore's posthumous honors, positions, and influence should be stripped due to newly revealed evidence of criminal wrongdoing. It would be entirely within your rights as the primary victim of his manipulations to demand such proceedings." The implications hit Harry like a lightning bolt. A public trial with all the evidence laid bare for the entire wizarding world to see. Dumbledore's reputation torn apart, piece by piece, his manipulation exposed, his victims finally given voice. The network Master Regulus built would support such a trial, Kreacher continued. Families who have suffered under Dumbledore's greater good would testify. Ministry officials who have evidence of his interference would come forward. Even some of his former allies would be compelled to speak truthfully under veritaserum. Harry felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the opposite of the helplessness that had defined his life for so long. "You said there were vaults of evidence?" Kreacher smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. 7 vaults, young Master Potter, hidden in different locations, protected by house elf magic, accessible only to you or someone acting directly on your behalf. Documents, memories, witness testimonies, even financial records showing how Dumbledore has been manipulating ministry policy through carefully placed bribes and favors. The house elf moved to an ornate cabinet and withdrew a set of 7 keys, each one unique and glowing with protective enchantments. Master Regulus spent his family fortune gathering this evidence. He liquidated investments, sold heirlooms, even borrowed against the Black family properties to fund his investigation. Harry accepted the keys with something approaching reverence. Each one felt warm in his palm, thrumming with the same protective magic that filled this room. "Why?" he asked. "Why did he do all this for me? He barely knew my parents." "Because," Kreacher said simply, "Master Regulus understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become a bigger one. Dumbledore has spent decades manipulating people through their love, their loyalty, their desire to do good. But you, Harry Potter, you have been manipulated through suffering. You have been made into a weapon, not of love, but of righteous anger." The house elf fixed Harry with those enormous, knowing eyes. Master Regulus's final message will explain the rest. But first, you must understand what he is offering you. Not just revenge, though that is part of it. Not just justice, though that too is deserved. He is offering you the chance to reshape the wizarding world into something that will never again allow one man to manipulate so many lives for his vision of the greater good. Harry's hands tightened around the keys. For the first time since learning the truth about his parents' death, he felt something other than grief or rage. He felt powerful. "Open the letter," he said. Kreacher nodded and gestured toward the sealed envelope. Harry broke the protective charms with a touch, and the envelope fell open to reveal several sheets of parchment covered in Regulus's elegant handwriting. But it was the first line that made Harry's breath catch. "If you are reading this, Harry Potter, then you are the weapon they made. Choose to be the hand that wields it instead." Harry read on, his eyes widening as Regulus laid out not just the evidence and allies he had gathered, but a detailed strategy for using them, how to approach the surviving members of the Wizengamot, which journalists could be trusted to report the story accurately, how to use the House Elf network to coordinate simultaneous revelations across multiple fronts. But it was the letter's conclusion that truly took Harry's breath away. You were born to be a sacrifice in someone else's war. Your parents died to further someone else's vision. Your childhood was stolen to serve someone else's definition of the greater good. You owe the wizarding world nothing. They have failed you at every turn. But you owe yourself everything. You owe yourself the truth. You owe yourself justice. You owe yourself the chance to live as Harry Potter, not as the boy who lived or the chosen one, or any other role they have tried to force upon you. The tools are here. The allies wait. The evidence is irrefutable. All that remains is for you to choose. Will you remain the victim of Albus Dumbledore's manipulations, or will you become the architect of his downfall? The choice, for perhaps the first time in your life, is entirely yours. Harry B. Harry set the letter down with hands that trembled, not with shock or grief, but with anticipation. He looked up at Kreacher, who watched him with something that might have been pride. "When do we begin?" Harry asked. Kreacher's smile could have lit the entire room. "We begin now, Master Potter. We begin with the dawn." Chapter 7. Gathering the Worthy. 3 days after learning the truth about Albus Dumbledore, Harry sat in Regulus's study, reviewing the list of potential allies with a clarity of purpose he had never experienced before. Gone were the sleepless nights of doubt and self-recrimination that had plagued him since Dumbledore's death. In their place was something harder and infinitely more useful, the cold satisfaction of a plan finally set in motion. Kreacher materialized beside him with a soft pop, carrying a silver tray laden with correspondence. "The responses are arriving, Master Potter," the house elf said, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Several families have agreed to meet, though they remain cautious." Harry nodded, sorting through the letters with practiced efficiency. 3 days of careful planning had taught him that approaching Dumbledore's victims required delicate timing and absolute discretion. Each potential ally needed to be contacted through different channels, with different arguments tailored to their specific grievances. "Narcissa Malfoy responds first," he murmured, recognizing the elegant script on expensive parchment. The letter was brief, but the subtext was clear. She was interested, but only if Harry could prove he wasn't walking into a trap. It made perfect sense. According to Regulus's intelligence, Narcissa had been questioning Dumbledore's methods for months, particularly his willingness to sacrifice children for the greater good. Her own son was currently in hiding, marked for death by both sides of the war, and she had grown desperate enough to consider alliances that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Arrange a meeting," Harry told Kreacher. "Somewhere neutral, but secure. And make sure she understands I'm not coming as the boy who lived or the chosen one. I'm coming as someone who's finally learned the truth about what Dumbledore really was." Kreacher nodded approvingly. Master Regulus always said that the best allies are those who have already begun questioning the same things you are. Narcissa Malfoy has been questioning for quite some time. The meeting took place that evening in a private room above a disreputable tavern in Nocturne Alley, exactly the sort of place respectable witches avoided, which made it perfect for clandestine conversations. Harry arrived first, his features hidden beneath a glamour charm, and settled into a booth that offered clear sightlines to all entrances. Narcissa Malfoy entered 10 minutes later, moving with the careful grace of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. She had discarded her usual elaborate robes in favor of a simple black cloak that could belong to anyone, but her bearing remained unmistakably aristocratic. "Mr. Potter," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I confess myself curious about your sudden interest in my family's perspective on recent events. I've learned some things about Dumbledore that I think you'll find interesting," Harry replied, studying her face for any sign of deception. Things that suggest he was rather more manipulative than anyone realized. Narcissa's expression didn't change, but Harry caught the slight tensing around her eyes that suggested intense interest. "I have long suspected that Albus Dumbledore was not the benevolent figure he presented himself to be." "Oh?" Harry leaned forward. "What gave you that impression?" "Many things, accumulated over years." Narcissa's voice remained carefully neutral, but Harry could hear the anger underneath. The way he allowed children to be placed in mortal danger, year after year. The way he withheld crucial intelligence from both sides, prolonging the conflict unnecessarily. The way he seemed to view people as pieces on a chessboard, to be sacrificed when convenient. Harry felt a surge of vindication. If Narcissa Malfoy, no friend to his cause, had reached similar conclusions independently, then perhaps Regulus's network was more solid than he'd dared hope. "I have evidence," he said simply. "Memories, documents, witness testimony. Enough to prove that everything you suspected was true, and worse besides." Narcissa leaned back, her pale eyes calculating. "Evidence of what, specifically?" "Evidence that Dumbledore orchestrated my parents' death. Evidence that he deliberately placed me with abusive relatives to shape me into a willing martyr. Evidence that he has been manipulating the entire wizarding world for decades, using people's love and loyalty as weapons against them." The silence that followed was profound. Narcissa stared at him with an expression Harry couldn't quite read. Shock, perhaps, or maybe recognition of a truth she had always feared. "You have proof of this?" she asked finally. "I have proof," Harry confirmed. "And I'm building a coalition of everyone who has been harmed by his manipulations. I thought you might be interested in seeing justice done." "Justice?" Narcissa repeated the word, as if tasting something bitter. "And what form would this justice take?" "A formal trial before the Wizengamot," Harry explained. "A public examination of Dumbledore's legacy, with all evidence presented under oath and veritaserum, the complete destruction of his reputation, and the dismantling of every institution he controlled." For the first time since entering the tavern, Narcissa smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Count the House of Malfoy among your allies, Mr. Potter," she said, "but know that we expect results, not merely promises." She reached into a cloak and withdrew a small leather portfolio. A gesture of good faith. These are copies of correspondence between Dumbledore and certain ministry officials, dating back to the 1970s. They concern the deliberate suppression of intelligence that could have prevented several Death Eater attacks. Harry accepted the portfolio with something approaching awe. More evidence, freely given, and from a source he had never expected to provide it. Their meeting concluded with arrangements for future communication, and Harry left the tavern with the satisfaction of one successful recruitment. But Narcissa Malfoy was only the beginning. 2 days later, He sat across from Amelia Bones in her private office at the Ministry, watching the formidable witch review copies of Regulus's evidence with growing horror. "This is unconscionable," Bones said finally, setting down a particularly damning memory transcript. "If even a fraction of this is accurate—" "All of it is accurate," Harry assured her. "And it's only the beginning. There are dozens more memories, hundreds of documents, enough to bury Dumbledore's reputation so completely that no one will ever again be able to claim he was working for the greater good." Bones looked up at him, with eyes that held decades of professional skepticism. "Why bring this to me, Potter? What do you want from the DMLE?" "I want a fair hearing," Harry replied. "When I bring formal charges against Dumbledore's legacy, I want them investigated properly. No cover-ups, no political maneuvering, no appeals to his past heroism. Just the facts, presented to the Wizengamot and the public. And in return? In return, you get the chance to bring one of the greatest criminals in wizarding history to justice," Harry said simply. "Even if he's beyond earthly punishment, his victims deserve to have their truth acknowledged." Bones was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to read an opponent's strategy. Finally, she nodded. "The DMLE will treat any formal charges you bring with the seriousness they deserve," she said. "But Potter, if you're wrong about this, if any of this evidence proves fabricated or misleading, I'll throw you in Azkaban myself." "I understand," Harry replied, "and I welcome the scrutiny. The truth has nothing to fear from investigation." His next recruit was Augusta Longsbottom, and that meeting proved to be the most emotionally difficult yet. The elderly witch received him in the sitting room of Longbottom House, her usually stern demeanour softened by the weight of old grief. "You want to discuss Albus Dumbledore's failures," she said, without preamble once they were seated. "I've been waiting years for someone to ask the right questions about that man." "What questions?" Harry asked gently. "Questions like why he allowed my son and daughter-in-law to walk into an obvious trap," Augusta replied, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "Questions like why crucial intelligence about Death Eater safe houses was withheld from the Aura Department. Questions like why Frank and Alice were abandoned to their fate when a single owl could have warned them away." Harry felt his heart clench at the raw anguish in her words. Another family destroyed by Dumbledore's manipulations, another set of victims whose suffering had been deemed acceptable for the greater good. "I have evidence that Dumbledore possessed intelligence about the Lestrange's location and intentions 3 days before they attacked your family," he said quietly. "Intelligence he chose not to share." Augusta's teacup rattled against its saucer. "You have proof of this?" "Memory evidence, corroborated by multiple sources," Harry confirmed. "Your son and daughter-in-law died because Dumbledore calculated their sacrifice would serve his larger strategy." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Augusta Longbottom weeping, not the dramatic sobs of fresh grief, but the quiet tears of someone whose worst fears had finally been confirmed. "What do you need from me?" she asked when she could speak again. "Your testimony before the Wizengamot," Harry replied. "Your voice as the matriarch of one of the most respected families in Britain. When you speak, people listen." "Then they will hear everything," Augusta promised, steel returning to her voice. "Every detail of how that man's manipulations destroyed my family, every question I was told not to ask, every inconsistency I was encouraged to ignore, all of it." By the end of the week, Harry had secured commitments from 7 families spanning multiple political factions and social classes. Even more surprisingly, he had gained an unexpected ally in Professor McGonagall, who arrived at Grimmauld Place one evening, looking years older than when he had last seen her. "Mr. Potter," she said without preamble, "I understand you've been making inquiries about Albus Dumbledore's methods." Harry studied her face, noting the deep lines of exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. "Professor McGonagall, I wasn't sure you would be willing to hear what I've discovered." "I've been hearing it in my nightmares for months," she replied quietly. "The things he said, the decisions he made, the way he spoke about you and your parents as if you were expendable." She took a shuddering breath. "I served that man faithfully for 40 years, Mr. Potter. I trusted his judgment, defended his choices, enabled his manipulations because I believed he was working for the greater good. And now? Now I realize that the greater good was often just another term for whatever Albus Dumbledore wanted," McGonagall said, her voice hollow with self-recrimination. "I should have questioned him, should have demanded explanations, should have protected you better." Harry felt an unexpected surge of compassion for the woman who had been one of the few stable presences in his Hogwarts years. "You were manipulated too, Professor. He was very good at making people believe they were complicit in his wisdom rather than victims of his schemes." McGonagall looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude. "What can I do to make amends?" "Help me ensure this never happens again," Harry said simply. "Help me build something better from the ruins of what he created." As the days passed and his coalition grew, Harry found himself marveling at how easily the pieces fell into place. Regulus had been right. The wizarding world was full of people who had been hurt by Dumbledore's manipulations, people who had been waiting for someone with the legitimacy and evidence to challenge his legacy. Kreacher coordinated communications between the various allies, using the House Elf network to pass messages with a security that no wizard-monitored owl post could match. Maps appeared on the study walls, showing the growing web of connections, names linked by colored threads that represented shared grievances and mutual commitment to justice. "It's working," Harry said one evening as he reviewed reports from across Britain. "People are listening. They're angry. They're ready for the truth." "Master Regulus would be proud," Kreacher replied, his ancient eyes bright with satisfaction. "You have built something he could only dream of, a coalition powerful enough to challenge even the memory of Albus Dumbledore." Harry nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new recruits, new evidence to catalogue and present. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction as he contemplated the network of allies that stretched across the wizarding world, all of them united by a single, powerful truth. Albus Dumbledore had manipulated them all, but Harry Potter was going to make sure the world finally knew it. Chapter 8. The Evidence Unveiled. The first of Regulus's evidence vaults lay hidden beneath a defunct apothecary shop in Diagon Alley, protected by wards so complex that even Kreacher required nearly an hour to unravel them safely. Harry stood in the narrow cellar space, watching the house elf work with methodical precision, while the representatives of his growing coalition waited above ground with varying degrees of impatience. "Master Regulus was very thorough with his security," Kreacher murmured, his gnarled fingers tracing intricate patterns in the air above a vault door that appeared to be carved from a single piece of obsidian. He knew that if his evidence were discovered too early, it would be destroyed before it could serve its purpose. The final ward dissolved with a sound like sighing wind, and the vault door swung open to reveal a space far larger than should have been possible in the cramped cellar. Shelves lined every wall, filled with documents, memory vials, and artifacts that pulsed with their own inner light. At the center of the room sat a desk covered with maps and correspondence, as if Regulus had just stepped away from his work. "My God," breathed Amelia Bones from the vault's entrance, her professional composure cracking as she took in the scope of the evidence before them. "How much did he gather?" "Everything," Kreacher replied simply. Master Regulus understood that to defeat a man like Albus Dumbledore, you needed not just proof of his crimes, but proof of the system that enabled them. Harry moved deeper into the vault, his eyes drawn to a collection of letters bound with black ribbon. The handwriting on the topmost envelope was elegant, familiar from his years at Hogwarts, but the name in the address line made his blood run cold. Gellert Grindelwald, Nurmengard prison. "These are dated 1975, Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at the assembled group: Bones, Augusta Longbottom, Narcissa Malfoy, and Professor McGonagall, all of whom had come to witness the opening of the first vault. Dumbledore was still corresponding with Grindelwald, decades after their supposed falling out. McGonagall's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Albus defeated Grindelwald in 1945. He would never have—" "Read it," Harry interrupted, holding out the letter with hands that trembled slightly. "Read what your precious mentor was really doing while he preached about the dangers of dark wizards." McGonagall took the letter with obvious reluctance, but her expression changed as she read. Horror replaced disbelief, then disgust, then something that might have been recognition of a truth she had always feared to confront. "He's asking for advice," she said hollowly, "about population control, about managing inferior magical bloodlines, about the most efficient ways to reshape wizarding society." She looked up at Harry with eyes that held the devastation of absolute disillusionment. "This isn't the correspondence of enemies, this is collaboration." "Keep reading," Harry advised grimly. "It gets worse." The letters revealed a conspiracy spanning decades. Dumbledore and Grindelwald had never truly been enemies. Their 1945 duel had been carefully choreographed theatre, designed to give Dumbledore the reputation he needed to reshape the wizarding world according to their shared vision. Grindelwald's imprisonment was comfortable exile, his punishment a strategic withdrawal that allowed him to advise from the shadows, while Dumbledore implemented their plans with a benevolent facade. "They planned it all," Augusta Longbottom said, her voice tight with fury as she reviewed documents detailing the systematic elimination of old magical families who refused to conform to their vision. The wars, the conflicts, the careful cultivation of fear and desperation that made people willing to surrender their freedoms for the promise of security. Narcissa nodded grimly. This explains so much about the past decades, the way certain families rose to prominence while others mysteriously declined, the way ministry policies always seemed to favor Dumbledore's allies while hindering his opponents, the way dissent was slowly but systematically discouraged through social pressure and economic manipulation. But it was the next collection of documents that truly staggered them. Filed under Project Chosen, they found detailed research into alternatives to Harry's prophesied sacrifice, alternatives that Dumbledore had not only ignored but actively suppressed. "Look at this," Bones said, holding up a thick folder with shaking hands. Research proposals from the Department of Mysteries, dating back to 1981. 3 different methods for destroying Horcruxes without requiring the death of the host. 2 separate approaches for transferring the prophecy's power to willing adult volunteers. Even a theoretical framework for binding Voldemort's soul to objects that could be safely destroyed. Harry felt sick as he reviewed proposal after proposal, each one offering hope that had been deliberately crushed. Every alternative had been rejected, not because it was unfeasible, but because it would have interfered with Dumbledore's preferred narrative of necessary sacrifice. "He wanted me to die," Harry said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "Not because it was the only way, but because a martyred boy hero was more useful to his cause than a living wizard who might ask uncomfortable questions." "There's more," Kreacher said quietly, gesturing toward another section of the vault. Evidence of how Dumbledore manipulated ministry policy to ensure the Dark Lord's rise to power. The files in this section detailed a conspiracy so vast and intricate that it took Harry several minutes to fully comprehend its scope. Dumbledore had spent decades placing his allies in key ministry positions while simultaneously undermining competent officials who might have posed obstacles to his plans. Laws that could have prevented Voldemort's rise were quietly buried in committee. Intelligence that could have stopped Death Eater attacks was mysteriously delayed or misfiled. Resources that could have protected vulnerable families were redirected to projects that served Dumbledore's larger strategy. He needed Voldemort, McGonagall realized, her voice hollow with horror. He needed a Dark Lord terrible enough to justify any measures taken against him. He needed people to be desperate enough to accept his leadership without question. And when Tom Riddle wasn't quite terrifying enough, Narcissa added, reviewing documents about the manipulation of key Death Eater families, Dumbledore made sure he became worse, pushed him toward greater extremes, isolated him from potential moderating influences, even provided him with certain magical knowledge that transformed him from a dangerous wizard into a genuine monster. The evidence was overwhelming, damning beyond any possibility of denial or excuse. By the time they had reviewed the contents of just the first vault, Harry's coalition possessed enough proof to destroy not just Dumbledore's reputation, but the entire system of power he had built around himself. "We need to plan this carefully," Bones said, as they gathered around the central desk to discuss their next moves. "Evidence this explosive could destabilize the entire wizarding world if released improperly." "Destabilization might be exactly what we need," Augusta countered. "The current system is built on lies and manipulation. Better to tear it down and rebuild than to allow it to continue corrupting everything it touches." Harry found himself nodding in agreement. Regulus was right. This isn't just about justice for individual victims. This is about preventing anyone from ever accumulating this much power again. They spent the next several hours planning their revelation strategy. The Daily Prophet would be their primary vehicle for reaching the public, but they would need to coordinate with multiple sources to prevent the story from being suppressed or discredited. Rita Skeeter, despite her reputation for sensationalism, had already agreed to write a series of exposé articles in exchange for exclusive access to certain documents. More importantly, several respected journalists had committed to covering the story from different angles, ensuring that the narrative couldn't be controlled by any single publication. The legal strategy was more complex. Amelia Bones explained that while Dumbledore was beyond earthly justice, they could still pursue a formal trial of his legacy, a legal proceeding that would examine his fitness to retain his various posthumous honors and positions of influence. If successful, such a trial would result in Dumbledore's name being stripped from institutions, his portrait being removed from official buildings, and his entire body of work being re-evaluated in light of newly revealed evidence. "The precedent exists," Bones assured them. "We've done it before with other historical figures who were later revealed to be corrupt. The process is thorough, public, and irreversible." "And if we can prove treason or crimes against wizard kind," McGonagall added reluctantly, "the trial could also investigate everyone who enabled him. That would include many current ministry officials, members of the Wizengamot, even certain Hogwarts governors." The implications were staggering. A successful trial wouldn't just destroy Dumbledore, it would sweep away the entire network of power and influence he had built over decades of manipulation. But it was Kreacher who provided the most unexpected element of their strategy. "Master Regulus made arrangements with house elves across Britain," the ancient elf announced, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "For generations, we have served in the homes of the powerful, invisible, and ignored while they conducted their most private business. We have seen everything, heard everything, remembered everything." Harry leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you saying, Kreacher?" "House elves cannot lie when directly questioned by their masters," Kreacher explained. "But we can testify truthfully about what we have witnessed. And what we have witnessed, Master Potter, would shock even you." The house elf produced a crystal memory device similar to a pensieve, but smaller and more portable. Memories from house elves in dozens of prominent families, conversations thought private, decisions made in secret, crimes committed in the belief that only inferior magical creatures were watching. Narcissa's eyes widened as she understood the implications. House elf testimony is legally admissible and practically impossible to refute. If they're willing to testify about what they've witnessed in their service, the entire power structure of Wizarding Britain will collapse, Augusta finished grimly. "Good. It's been corrupt for far too long." As their planning session drew to a close, Harry found himself contemplating the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. The revelation wouldn't just destroy Dumbledore, it would force the entire wizarding world to confront uncomfortable truths about power, manipulation, and the willingness to look the other way when convenient. "Where do we make the announcement?" he asked finally. "Where do we hold the first public revelation?" The answer came from McGonagall, her voice steady despite the devastation in her eyes. "Hogwarts," she said simply. "In the Great Hall, where Albus Dumbledore spent decades shaping young minds to accept his vision of the world, where he trained generations of witches and wizards to trust his judgment without question, where it all began." Harry nodded slowly, feeling the rightness of it. Hogwarts, where he had first learned to trust Dumbledore, where he had been shaped into the willing sacrifice the old man required. It was fitting that the revelation of Dumbledore's true nature should take place in the very heart of his power. "How long do we need to prepare?" he asked. 2 weeks, Bones replied after consulting her notes. 2 weeks to coordinate the media coverage, file the legal paperwork, and ensure that our evidence is properly documented and secured. 2 weeks to give Dumbledore's enablers a chance to distance themselves before the storm breaks. And after that? McGonagall's smile was grim but determined. "After that, Mr. Potter, we change everything." As they prepared to leave the vault, Harry took one last look around at the evidence Regulus had died to preserve. Thousands of documents, hundreds of memories, decades of proof that the wizarding world's greatest hero had been its greatest monster. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new preparations, new allies to recruit and evidence to catalogue. But tonight, for the first time since learning the truth about his parents' death, Harry felt something approaching peace. Justice was coming, not just for him, not just for his parents, but for everyone who had suffered under Dumbledore's benevolent tyranny. The reckoning was at hand. Chapter 9. The Return to Hogwarts. The Great Hall of Hogwarts had seen many extraordinary gatherings in its 1,000-year history, but perhaps none quite like this. Word had spread through the wizarding world with the peculiar speed that only truly shocking news could achieve. Harry Potter was calling for a public hearing to address grave concerns about the legacy of Albus Dumbledore. The formal invitation, bearing the seals of multiple ancient houses and the imprimatur of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, had been impossible to ignore. Harry stood at the entrance to the Great Hall, watching as witches and wizards filed in with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. The summer evening light streamed through the enchanted windows, but the atmosphere was winter cold with tension and barely suppressed conflict. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Potter?" Professor McGonagall asked quietly from beside him. The past 2 weeks had aged her visibly. The weight of the evidence she had reviewed, the complicity she had unknowingly enabled for decades, had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. "As ready as anyone can be to destroy the reputation of the most beloved wizard in Britain," Harry replied, adjusting the weight of the evidence case in his hands. Regulus's memories, documents, and testimonies, everything they had gathered, verified, and prepared for this moment. The hall was nearly full now, an unusual mix of students who had remained for summer programs, teachers, ministry officials, members of the Wizengamot, journalists and curious citizens who had somehow secured invitations through various connections. Harry recognized faces both friendly and hostile. The Weasley family sat together near the front, their expressions ranging from confused to concerned. Several members of the Order of the Phoenix clustered near the staff table, whispering among themselves with obvious unease. Lord Malfoy and other influential purebloods occupied a section on the left, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes sharp with interest. At the high table, McGonagall took her place in what had once been Dumbledore's chair. The sight of it empty had clearly cost her, but she maintained her composure as she addressed the assembled crowd. "Thank you all for coming," McGonagall began, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "We are gathered at the request of Harry Potter, who has formally petitioned for a public hearing regarding newly discovered evidence concerning the late Albus Dumbledore. This is not a trial in the legal sense, but rather an opportunity for concerned members of our community to present information and testimony for public consideration. A murmur ran through the crowd, some approving, others clearly sceptical. Harry caught sight of Kingsley Shacklebolt near the ministry delegation, his face troubled but attentive. Rita Skeeter sat with the press contingent, her acid green quill already scratching notes across her parchment. "Before we begin," McGonagall continued, "I want to acknowledge that what we may hear tonight could be disturbing. Some of you may find it difficult to reconcile new information with long-held beliefs. I ask only that you listen with open minds and judge the evidence on its merits." Harry stepped forward, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. For a moment, the old uncertainty tried to creep in, the voice that whispered he was just a 17-year-old boy challenging the greatest wizard who had ever lived. But then he remembered his parents' faces in those terrible memories, remembered the calculated cruelty of his childhood, remembered all the victims whose suffering had been deemed acceptable for Dumbledore's greater good. "My name is Harry Potter," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to unleash. "Many of you know me as the boy who lived, the chosen one, the weapon prophesied to destroy Voldemort. Tonight I'm here to tell you that those titles, that entire identity, was manufactured by Albus Dumbledore as part of a deception that spans decades and has cost countless innocent lives." The murmur that rippled through the hall was louder now, tinged with disbelief and growing anger. Harry pressed on, knowing that once he began this revelation, there would be no turning back. 3 weeks ago, I discovered evidence that Dumbledore deliberately orchestrated my parents' death, knowing that their sacrifice would create the blood protection he needed for his long-term plans. I learned that he placed me with relatives he knew would abuse me, turning down 13 different pureblood families who offered me loving homes because he needed me to grow up desperate enough to die willingly when the time came. "That's preposterous." The shout came from Elphias Doge, who had risen from his seat among the Order members. "Albus Dumbledore was the greatest wizard of our age. How dare you? How dare I present evidence?" Harry interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "How dare I demand answers about why so many people have suffered while Dumbledore pursued his vision of the greater good? Let me show you what I discovered." With careful deliberation, Harry began extracting memories from his evidence case, placing them in the portable pensieve that McGonagall had provided. This first memory comes from Regulus Black, who spent the final months of his life investigating Dumbledore's methods. The silvery memory swirled in the basin, and Harry used his wand to project it above the assembled crowd so everyone could see. Gasps echoed through the hall as the scene formed in mid-air. Dumbledore and McGonagall in his office, discussing Harry's necessary sacrifice and the need to forge him through suffering. "No," McGonagall whispered from the high table, her face pale as she watched her younger self unknowingly participate in Dumbledore's manipulation. "I never understood. I never realized what he was really saying." But Harry was already preparing the next memory, Dumbledore's conversation with Snape, using the potions master's grief over Lily's death to bind him to decades of service in shaping Harry for his eventual sacrifice. Several members of the audience were on their feet now, shouting protests and demands for explanation, but their voices died away as the memory continued to unfold. The reaction when Harry showed the memory of Dumbledore deliberately ignoring intelligence about Pettigrew's betrayal was immediate and visceral. Molly Weasley burst into tears. Arthur sat beside her with his face in his hands. Even some of Dumbledore's staunchest defenders began to look uncertain, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion to the first stirrings of horrible understanding. "This is fabricated," Elphias Doge insisted, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "These memories could have been altered, manipulated." "Could they?" The new voice came from the entrance to the Great Hall, and every head turned to see Severus Snape standing in the doorway. The potions master looked haggard, as if he had been battling internal demons for weeks, but his black eyes were clear and filled with a terrible resolution. "Professor Snape," McGonagall said, rising from her chair. "I wasn't certain you would come." "I came," Snape replied quietly, walking down the center aisle with his characteristic measured stride, "because I have spent 16 years living with the knowledge of what Albus Dumbledore really was, and I can no longer bear the weight of his secrets." The hall fell completely silent. Snape's reputation as Dumbledore's most loyal supporter was well known. If he was here to speak against the late headmaster, the implications were staggering. Snape reached the front of the hall and turned to face the assembled crowd. "Everything Potter has shown you is true," he said simply. "I know, because I was Dumbledore's willing instrument in most of it." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Snape began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed guilt and self-loathing. "Dumbledore used my grief over Lily Potter's death to manipulate me into serving his purposes. He made me believe that I was protecting her son, when in truth I was helping to shape him into the perfect martyr. Every cruel word I spoke to Potter, every harsh punishment I inflicted, every moment of misery I added to his school experience, all of it was done at Dumbledore's subtle direction, designed to ensure that Potter would view his own life as worthless when the time came for him to die." Several people in the crowd were weeping now. Others sat in stunned silence, their faces slack with shock. But some were growing angry, not at Dumbledore but at the messengers bringing this devastating truth. "You're lying!" Kingsley Shacklebolt had risen from his seat, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Both of you! Albus Dumbledore spent his entire life fighting dark wizards, protecting innocent people, building a better world." "He spent his entire life playing God," Harry shot back, his own anger finally breaking free, "deciding who lived and who died, who deserved happiness and who deserved suffering, whose dreams mattered and whose could be sacrificed for his greater vision." Harry gestured to his assembled allies, who had been sitting quietly in reserved sections of the hall. "Amelia Bones will tell you how Dumbledore withheld intelligence that could have saved dozens of Auror lives. Augusta Longbottom will explain how her son and daughter-in-law died because Dumbledore calculated their sacrifice would serve his strategy. Narcissa Malfoy will share correspondence proving that Dumbledore has been manipulating ministry policy for decades, ensuring that conflicts continued longer than necessary because war served his purposes better than peace. One by one, his allies rose and presented their testimony. Each revelation was like another hammer blow against the edifice of Dumbledore's reputation. The audience fragmented visibly as the evidence mounted, some accepting the horrible truth, others clinging desperately to their faith in the man who had shaped their world. The breaking point came when Harry presented the evidence of Dumbledore's continued correspondence with Grindelwald, showing their decades-long collaboration in reshaping Wizarding Society according to their shared vision of benevolent tyranny. "No!" The cry came from multiple voices at once. Several Order members were on their feet, shouting accusations of fabrication and lies, but their protests were drowned out by the growing chorus of those who had finally seen enough evidence to convince them. "I've heard enough," declared Lord Abbot, rising from his seat among the Wizengamot delegation. "If even half of what we've seen tonight is true, then Albus Dumbledore was guilty of treason, murder, and crimes against wizardkind." "The evidence is overwhelming," Amelia Bones agreed, her official authority lending weight to her words. "I move that the Ministry begin formal proceedings to strip Albus Dumbledore of all posthumous honors and investigate everyone who enabled his crimes." The hall erupted in chaos. Supporters and opponents of the motion began shouting at each other across the aisles. Several physical altercations broke out as emotions boiled over. Through it all, Harry stood at the center of the storm, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had done it. The truth was out, spreading through the wizarding world like wildfire. Some would accept it, others would deny it, but no one could claim ignorance any longer. "I want to say one final thing," Harry called out, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who had faced death multiple times and survived. The hall gradually quieted as people turned to listen. "I was raised to be a weapon in Albus Dumbledore's war," Harry said. "I was shaped by suffering and manipulation to become the perfect sacrifice for his vision of the greater good. But I am not that weapon anymore. I am not the boy who lived, or the chosen one, or any other role he tried to force upon me." Harry looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of friends and enemies alike. "I am Harry James Potter. I am the son of parents who were murdered not by Voldemort alone, but by the man you trusted to protect them. I am someone who has seen the truth about power and manipulation, and has chosen to fight against it, rather than perpetuate it." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sound of weeping from various corners of the hall. "The choice now is yours," Harry continued. "You can cling to comfortable lies about Dumbledore's benevolence, or you can face the truth about what he really was, and work to build something better from the ruins of what he created. You can remain victims of his manipulation, or you can choose to be free." With that, Harry gathered his evidence case and walked from the hall, leaving behind a wizarding world that would never be quite the same again. Behind him, the arguments and accusations continued, but he no longer needed to participate in them. The truth had been spoken. Now it would do its work. Chapter 10. The Price of Truth. The morning after the Hogwarts revelation, the wizarding world woke to headlines that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. Harry sat in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place, surrounded by every major publication in Britain, each one blazoning the story across their front pages in increasingly dramatic typography. "Dumbledore, hero or monster?" screamed the Daily Prophet, featuring a massive photograph of Harry presenting his evidence to the assembled crowd. "The boy who lived reveals the truth behind the lies." The Quibbler had gone with something more direct. Albus Dumbledore, Master Manipulator exposed. Even the usually conservative Wizarding Wireless was running hourly updates about the Dumbledore revelations and their implications for magical society. But it was the personal correspondence arriving by Owl that truly showed Harry the magnitude of what they had unleashed. Letter after letter, some supportive, others venomous, all of them proving that the wizarding world was fracturing exactly as he had anticipated. "Listen to this one," Ron said from across the table, his voice tight with barely controlled anger as he read from a particularly nasty piece of hate mail. "Potter, you treacherous little blood traitor, how dare you spit on the memory of the greatest wizard who ever lived? Dumbledore saved us all from you-know-who, and this is how you repay him? You're nothing but an attention-seeking brat who can't stand not being the center of everything." Ron crumpled the letter in his fist. "There's more, but it gets worse from there." "They're scared," Hermione said quietly, though her own hands shook slightly as she sorted through the correspondence. "People are always angry when their fundamental beliefs are challenged, especially when the evidence is too strong to dismiss." Harry nodded, though the volume of vitriol was still overwhelming. For every letter of support, and there were many, there seemed to be two more filled with accusations, threats, and desperate attempts to discredit what they had revealed. "Look at this," Hermione continued, holding up an official-looking document. "It's from the International Confederation of Wizards. They're launching their own investigation into Dumbledore's influence on international magical policy over the past 50 years. Apparently, several countries have been questioning certain agreements and treaties that Dumbledore helped negotiate. The implications were staggering. If Dumbledore's manipulation extended beyond Britain, and Harry strongly suspected it did, then the revelations could destabilize magical governments across the globe." A sharp knock at the front door interrupted Harry's thoughts. Kreacher appeared with a pop, his expression troubled. "Master Potter, there are aurors at the door. They say they need to speak with you about matters of magical security. Young Master's friends, the Weasleys, are with them." Harry exchanged glances with Ron and Hermione. "Send them in, Kreacher. And thank you." Arthur Weasley entered first, looking haggard and older than Harry had ever seen him. Behind him came Percy, who wore his ministry robes with obvious discomfort, and Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose expression was carefully neutral. "Harry," Arthur said without preamble, "we need to talk." They gathered in the sitting room, the same space where Harry had once attended order meetings under Dumbledore's leadership. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. "The ministry is in chaos," Percy reported, his usual pompous delivery replaced by genuine concern. 3 department heads have resigned since last night, including the head of the Department for International Magical Cooperation. There are calls for a complete investigation of anyone who worked closely with Dumbledore, and several Wizengamot members are demanding emergency sessions to address the crisis. "That's not the worst of it," Kingsley added grimly. "We've received intelligence that Death Eaters are using the chaos to recruit new supporters. They're telling people that if Dumbledore was corrupt, then maybe you-know-who's vision of magical society wasn't so wrong after all." Harry felt sick. He had anticipated that Voldemort would try to capitalize on the revelations, but hearing it confirmed still made his stomach lurch. "There's more," Arthur said quietly. "Hogwarts Board of Governors met in emergency session this morning. They're considering removing all of Dumbledore's portraits from the castle, stripping his name from buildings and scholarships, and conducting a complete review of everything he implemented during his tenure as headmaster." "Good," Harry said, though the word came out harder than he'd intended. "His influence on that school needs to be completely eliminated." "Harry," Hermione said gently, "some of the policies they're reviewing include things like the house elf working conditions, improvements, and the anti-discrimination measures for werewolves. Dumbledore may have been a monster, but he did accomplish some genuinely good things too." "Did he?" Harry challenged. "Or were those good things just more manipulation? Ways to build support and loyalty that he could exploit later?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications none of them wanted to confront. Percy cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There's something else you need to know. Several prominent families are demanding reparations for what they're calling educational malpractice. Parents are claiming that Dumbledore's manipulation of Hogwarts harmed their children psychologically and academically. Some are even filing lawsuits against the school itself." "As they should," Ron said angrily. "Think about all the times Dumbledore put students in danger, all the times he could have prevented disasters but chose not to because it served his purposes. Remember first year, when he could have stopped Quirrell at any point, but let us face Voldemort alone because it was educational?" Harry winced. The memory of that night, 11 years old and terrified, facing a possessed teacher while Dumbledore's Phoenix watched from the shadows, took on new and horrible meaning in light of what he now knew. "The problem," Kingsley continued, "is that dismantling Dumbledore's legacy isn't just about removing portraits and renaming buildings. His influence touched every aspect of magical society. Laws he helped draft, treaties he negotiated, policies he influenced, all of it needs to be re-examined. And while we're busy tearing everything down," Arthur added wearily, "you-know-who is still out there, still building his power base, still preparing for war." The weight of that reality settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Harry had exposed Dumbledore's crimes, but in doing so, he had also removed one of the few figures who had been actively opposing Voldemort's return to power. Corrupt and manipulative, though his methods had been. "We need to talk about your safety," Kingsley said, his tone becoming more official. "The Aura Department has received at least a dozen credible threats against your life since last night. Not from Death Eaters, from Dumbledore supporters who blame you for destroying their hero." Harry wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still sent a chill through him. "What kind of threats?" "Everything from simple assault to elaborate revenge plots," Percy reported, consulting his notes. "One witch in Devon has apparently been brewing illegal cursed potions with your name on them. A wizard in Scotland sent a letter detailing exactly how he plans to make you pay for your treachery. There are others. I can handle myself, Harry said, though he appreciated their concern. Can you handle yourself against 50 angry witches and wizards? Kingsley challenged. Because that's how many people we've identified as potential threats just in the past 12 hours. Before Harry could respond, another knock echoed through the house. This time, Kreacher returned with a delegation that made everyone in the room tense. Narcissa Malfoy, accompanied by 2 witches Harry didn't recognize, but whose expensive robes and bearing marked them as influential purebloods. Mrs. Malfoy, Arthur said stiffly. This is unexpected. Mr. Weasley, Narcissa replied with equal coolness. I come bearing news that Mr. Potter needs to hear. She turned to Harry, her pale eyes serious. The Malfoy family vault at Gringotts was broken into last night. Nothing was taken, but certain documents were examined. Documents related to our recent cooperation with your cause. Harry felt his blood run cold. Death Eaters? Uncertain, but likely, one of Narcissa's companions replied. The same thing happened to the Greengrass and Parkinson family vaults. Someone is investigating which families have allied themselves with you. It gets worse, the other witch added. There have been attacks on 3 families who publicly supported your revelations. Nothing fatal, but the message was clear. Supporting you comes with consequences. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Harry's revelation hadn't just exposed Dumbledore, it had painted targets on the backs of everyone who had helped him. I'm sorry, Harry said quietly. I never wanted. Don't, Narcissa interrupted firmly. We knew the risks when we chose to help you. The truth needed to come out, whatever the cost. Besides, the first witch added with a grim smile, we're not defenseless. The families who've allied with you represent significant magical power and political influence. Anyone who thinks we'll be easy targets is about to learn otherwise. A new owl arrived as they spoke, this one carrying a letter with the seal of the International Confederation of Wizards. Hermione opened it and read quickly, her face growing pale. What is it? Harry asked. They want you to testify before the International Council, she said slowly, about Dumbledore's influence on global magical policy. They're particularly interested in his role in the treaty negotiations with the Goblin nations and his involvement in the werewolf registration policies. Harry stared at the letter, feeling the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders once again. He had wanted to expose Dumbledore's crimes and free the wizarding world from his manipulation, but he was beginning to understand that destruction was easier than reconstruction. There's one piece of good news, Kingsley said, perhaps sensing Harry's growing overwhelm. The house elf communities across Britain have formally requested permission to honor Kreacher for his role in exposing the truth. It's unprecedented. House elves have never formally requested anything from the ministry before. Harry looked around the room at Kreacher, who had remained quietly in the corner throughout the meeting. The house elf's eyes were bright with what might have been tears. Master Regulus would be proud, Kreacher said softly. The truth he died to preserve has finally set many beings free. As the various visitors took their leave and plans were made for increased security measures, Harry found himself alone with Ron and Hermione in the kitchen once again. The weight of the past week, the revelations, the confrontations, the growing recognition of what they had unleashed, settled over him like a heavy cloak. Do you think we did the right thing? He asked quietly. Hermione was quiet for a long moment before answering. I think we did the necessary thing, she said finally. That's not always the same as the right thing, but sometimes it's the only thing. Ron nodded grimly. Dumbledore needed to be exposed. All those people he hurt, all those families he destroyed, they deserved justice, even if it came at a cost. Harry looked around the kitchen of Grimmauld Place, where it had all begun with Kreacher's revelations and Regulus's carefully preserved evidence. The wizarding world was fracturing, old alliances were crumbling, and new conflicts were emerging from the ruins of cherished beliefs. But for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly who he chose to be, free from the manipulation and expectations that had defined his existence for 17 years. The price of that freedom was higher than he had anticipated, but as he contemplated the letters of support mixed in with the threats, the families finding courage to speak their own truths, and the possibility of building something better from the ashes of Dumbledore's legacy, he realized it was a price worth paying. The truth, as painful as it might be, was always better than the most comfortable lie. Chapter 11. Forging a New Path. 3 months after the Hogwarts revelation, Harry stood in the newly renovated conference room of what had once been the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. The irony of the location wasn't lost on him. They were literally building something new from the foundations of one of the Ministry's most discriminatory departments. "The Charter for Magical Child Protection is ready for final review," Hermione announced, setting a thick document on the polished oak table around which his core allies had gathered. The past months had transformed their informal coalition into something far more substantial, a reform movement with legal authority, public support, and the resources to implement real change. Harry picked up the charter and scanned the carefully crafted language. After weeks of legal review and public consultation, they had created a comprehensive framework designed to prevent anyone from ever again manipulating magical children the way Dumbledore had manipulated him. Article 7 is particularly strong, Augusta Longbottom noted with satisfaction. No child in magical Britain can be placed in a home without independent magical and Muggle social services conducting joint inspections. No exceptions for blood protection or any other claimed magical necessity. And Article 12 establishes the Children's Magical Rights Tribunal, added Amelia Bones, who had been instrumental in drafting the legal frameworks. Any child over the age of 11 can petition the tribunal if they believe they're being manipulated or coerced by adult authority figures, including teachers, headmasters, or even ministry officials. Harry nodded, remembering his own desperate isolation during his school years. How different things might have been if he'd had somewhere to turn. Someone with legal authority to investigate his claims about Dumbledore's manipulation. "The Wizengamot vote is scheduled for next week," Arthur Weasley reported. "We have confirmed support from 2/3 of the members, enough to pass it into law." It would be Harry's first major legislative victory, but it was far from his only project. The past months had been a whirlwind of institution building, as his coalition worked to dismantle Dumbledore's legacy while constructing something better in its place. "How are the Hogwarts reforms progressing?" Harry asked McGonagall, who had thrown herself into transforming her beloved school with the zeal of someone seeking redemption. "Better than I dared hope," McGonagall replied, though her voice still carried the weight of guilt that had never fully left her. "The new Board of Governors includes representatives from all 4 houses, plus elected student representatives from each year. No single person will ever again have the unquestioned authority that Albus wielded." The transformation of Hogwarts had been one of their most visible successes. The school's new governance structure distributed power among multiple stakeholders, with transparency requirements and oversight mechanisms that made another Dumbledore-style manipulation effectively impossible. "The curriculum changes are equally important," McGonagall continued. "We've added mandatory courses on magical ethics, critical thinking, and the history of magical manipulation. Students will learn to question authority figures and recognize the warning signs of institutional corruption." "Speaking of education," Narcissa Malfoy interjected, "the Family Reconciliation Project is showing remarkable results." Harry had been particularly impressed by Narcissa's work in this area. Drawing on her experience as someone who had been manipulated by multiple authority figures, she had created a program to help families heal from decades of manipulation by both Voldemort and Dumbledore. "We've worked with 43 families so far," Narcissa reported. "Purebloods who were coerced into supporting the Dark Lord, half-bloods who were isolated and radicalized, even some Muggle-born families whose children were deliberately separated from their heritage to make them more dependent on magical authority figures. The family reconciliation project had been controversial at first. Many people struggled to accept that Death Eater families could also be victims of manipulation. But as the evidence mounted and families began sharing their stories, public opinion had gradually shifted toward recognition that Dumbledore and Voldemort had been two sides of the same coin, each using different methods to achieve similar goals of control. "The memorial planning is also complete," Kreacher announced, his voice filled with pride. The house elf had been transformed by his new role as liaison between magical creatures and wizards, his importance finally recognized after centuries of servitude. Harry's proposal for a memorial to the victims of Dumbledore's greater good had initially faced resistance, but public support had grown as more families came forward with their own stories of manipulation and loss. The memorial would be built in the heart of Diagon Alley, impossible to ignore or forget. "The inscription is beautiful," Hermione added, reading from her notes. "To those who suffered and died not for evil, but for the manipulations of one who claimed to serve good. Your sacrifice was not willing, but it was not meaningless. In your memory, we build a world where no one person's vision of the greater good can ever again demand the price of innocent lives." Harry felt a familiar tightness in his throat. His parents' names would be prominently featured on the memorial, along with the Longbottoms, the countless Aurors who had died because Dumbledore withheld intelligence, and dozens of other victims whose stories were only now being told. "The house elf representation proposal is ready for submission as well," Kreacher continued. "For the first time in magical history, house elves will have formal voices in government through the new Magical Creatures Council." This had been one of Harry's most personally important initiatives. Seeing how Kreacher and the house elf network had been instrumental in exposing the truth, Harry had pushed for formal recognition of magical creatures' rights and representation. The new council would give house elves, centaurs, goblins, and other magical beings direct input into laws that affected them. "The Gringotts goblins have agreed to the new financial oversight measures," added Lord Greengrass, who had joined their coalition after his own family's manipulation by both sides became clear. "No single wizard will ever again have the kind of financial influence that Dumbledore wielded through his various trusts and foundations." The financial reforms had been complex but crucial. Dumbledore's network of influence had been built as much on monetary manipulation as magical, carefully placed donations, strategic investments, and economic pressure that had allowed him to control institutions across magical Britain. "What about the international response?" Harry asked, turning to the newest member of their core group, a severe-looking witch named Director Chen, who represented the International Confederation of Wizards. "Transformative," Chen replied. "Your revelations about Dumbledore's global influence have sparked reform movements in 17 countries. The Confederation has established new protocols for investigating historical manipulation, and several nations are conducting their own reviews of treaties and agreements that Dumbledore influenced." Harry nodded, though he still sometimes felt overwhelmed by the international scope of what they had uncovered. Dumbledore's influence had extended far beyond Britain, and dismantling his global network would take years of careful work. "And the training program?" Harry asked, turning to his newest and most unexpected ally, Severus Snape, who sat somewhat apart from the others but had become indispensable to their efforts. "Progressing," Snape replied in his characteristic, clipped tones. 23 individuals have completed the initial course on detecting and resisting magical manipulation. The program is particularly effective for those who were previously victims themselves. Snape's rehabilitation had been slow and painful, but his intimate knowledge of Dumbledore's methods made him uniquely qualified to help others recognize and resist similar manipulation. His classes were small, private affairs, but the participants emerged with skills that would protect them from future exploitation. "And your own training, Harry?" McGonagall asked gently. Harry flexed his fingers, still marveling at the changes in his magical abilities since he had begun working with instructors who had no connection to Dumbledore's influence. "It's remarkable," he admitted. "For years I thought I was magically average, maybe even weak. Turns out that was just another part of Dumbledore's manipulation." Working with independent magical tutors, wizards and witches from other countries who had never been touched by Dumbledore's influence, Harry had discovered that his magical potential was far greater than he had ever imagined. Without the subtle blocks and limitations that Dumbledore had placed on his development, Harry's abilities were finally free to grow naturally. The diagnostic spells revealed over a dozen suppression charms, Snape added, with something that might have been professional interest. Cleverly woven, designed to limit power development while appearing to be natural limitations. It's taken months to safely remove them all. Harry still felt angry when he thought about those revelations. Even his magical education had been manipulated, his potential deliberately stunted to keep him dependent on Dumbledore's guidance. But the anger was tempered by the joy of finally discovering what he was truly capable of when free from external control. "The public opinion polls are encouraging," Arthur reported, consulting the latest surveys. "Support for our reforms has grown to 67%, up from 31% immediately after the initial revelations." The shift in public opinion had been gradual but steady. As more evidence emerged and more families shared their stories, the wizarding public had slowly accepted that fundamental change was necessary. The initial shock and denial had given way to anger at being deceived, which had in turn evolved into determination to build something better. "There's still significant resistance," Amelia warned. "The Dumbledore loyalists have organized into a formal opposition movement. They're calling for a return to traditional values and claiming that our reforms will weaken magical Britain's defenses against the dark arts." Harry sighed. Despite all the evidence, despite all the testimony from victims, there were still those who preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. The loyalists claimed that Dumbledore's methods, however harsh, had been necessary to protect the magical world from greater evils. "They're entitled to their opposition," Harry said firmly. "That's what democracy means. But they won't be allowed to manipulate or intimidate people into agreeing with them. We've built too many safeguards for that." As the meeting drew to a close, and various members of the coalition prepared to leave for their different projects, Harry remained behind with Kreacher in the quiet conference room. Through the windows, he could see Diagon Alley bustling with afternoon shoppers, the same street where his magical education had truly begun 7 years earlier. Master Regulus would be proud, Kreacher said softly, echoing the sentiment he had expressed many times over the past months. "I hope so," Harry replied. "Sometimes I wonder if we're building something he would have wanted, or just something different." "Different is enough," Kreacher assured him. Master Regulus didn't know what should be built to replace what Dumbledore had broken. He only knew that someone needed to do the building, and that it should be someone who understood the cost of manipulation. Harry nodded, looking around the room where former enemies had worked together to create something new. Narcissa Malfoy and Augusta Longbottom collaborating on family reconciliation programs. Severus Snape teaching people to resist the kind of manipulation he had once enabled. McGonagall rebuilding Hogwarts to ensure it could never again be the tool of a single person's vision. "We're not done yet," Harry said, as much to himself as to Kreacher. "There's still so much work to do." "Yes," Kreacher agreed, "but for the first time in decades, the work being done is honest work. Work that serves people rather than using them. Work that builds rather than manipulates." Harry stood and gathered his notes, preparing to leave for his next appointment, a meeting with a group of young wizards and witches who wanted to create a peer support network for those recovering from institutional manipulation. Every day brought new projects, new challenges, new opportunities to build something better from the ashes of what Dumbledore had created. As he walked through Diagon Alley toward his next meeting, Harry reflected on the changes of the past months. The wizarding world was different now, more suspicious of authority, more demanding of transparency, more protective of individual rights. It was messier than the world Dumbledore had controlled through manipulation and fear, but it was also more honest, more democratic, more genuinely protective of those who needed protection. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was not the boy who lived, or the chosen one, or any other role imposed upon him by others. He was simply Harry, a young man who had survived terrible manipulation and chosen to use that experience to protect others from the same fate. It was, he realized with quiet satisfaction, exactly who he had always wanted to be. Chapter 12. The Legacy Redeemed. 6 months after the world learned the truth about Albus Dumbledore, Harry Potter stood in Regulus Black's study for what would be the last time. The room had served its purpose, the evidence had been revealed, the truth had spread, and justice had begun its slow but inexorable work. Now it was time to honor the man who had made it all possible. "The memorial is ready, Master Potter," Kreacher announced, his voice carrying a pride that would have been impossible during his years of servitude. The house elf wore new robes now, finely made garments that reflected his status as the official liaison between magical creatures and the Ministry. But more than his clothing had changed. Kreacher walked taller, spoke with confidence, and carried himself like the respected figure he had become. Harry nodded, running his fingers along the edge of Regulus's desk one final time. They were converting this room into a permanent memorial. But first, there was something he needed to do. "Kreacher," Harry said quietly, "before we begin the ceremony, I want you to know that everything you've accomplished, everything we've built together, it's exactly what Regulus hoped for. He saved us all, and you made sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." The house elf's enormous eyes filled with tears. "Master Regulus would say that you saved yourselves, Master Potter. He only provided the truth. What you chose to do with it. That was your courage, not his." The installation ceremony for the Regulus Black Memorial was simple but profound. Representatives from dozens of families gathered in the study to witness the dedication of a magical plaque that would preserve Regulus's story for future generations. The past months of working together, of shared recognition of their mutual victimhood under Dumbledore's manipulation, had transformed their relationship into something approaching mutual respect. "Professor Snape," Harry replied, "I wasn't sure you would come." "I almost didn't," Snape admitted, studying the memorial plaque with an unreadable expression. "I spent so many years hating this house, hating the Black family's arrogance and their casual cruelty. I never thought I would stand in their ancestral home honoring one of their sons." Harry waited, understanding that Snape needed to work through his own complicated feelings about their shared history. "But Regulus Black saw what I was too blinded to see," Snape continued, "that Dumbledore was using my guilt and grief as weapons against me, that my loyalty to him was just another form of manipulation." He turned to Harry with something that might have been an apology in his dark eyes. "I spent 16 years helping to shape you into the weapon Dumbledore needed. I told myself it was to honor your mother's memory, but the truth is that I was too weak and too damaged to resist his manipulation." "We were both victims, Professor," Harry said quietly. "You, me, everyone who trusted him. The important thing is that we finally saw the truth and chose to act on it." Snape nodded slowly. "Your mother would have been proud of what you've accomplished. Not the boy who lived, not the chosen one. Just Harry Potter, who chose truth over comfort and justice over revenge." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men who had been shaped by the same terrible manipulations and who had found their way to healing through mutual understanding. "I should go," Snape said eventually. "I have students to teach, real teaching this time, not the performance of cruelty that Dumbledore encouraged." After Snape departed, Harry made his way to another part of the house that had been transformed in recent months. The formal drawing room had become a meeting space for what Harry had come to think of as his true inner circle, not followers or admirers, but friends and allies who chose to work with him because they shared his values, not because they had been manipulated into loyalty. Hermione was already there, reviewing notes from the latest session of the Wizengamot's Education Reform Committee. Ron sat beside her, sorting through letters from young witches and wizards who had applied to join their new training program for recognizing and resisting manipulation. "The applications keep coming," Ron reported with satisfaction. 47 this week alone. Word is spreading that there's finally somewhere people can go to learn how to protect themselves from corrupt authority figures. "The international interest is remarkable too," Hermione added. "We've received requests from 17 different countries asking for help in establishing similar programs." Luna Loveyarder arrived as they spoke, her usual dreamy expression tempered by the focused intensity she brought to her role in their organization. "The memorial garden is beautiful," she announced. "I think the Nargles approve. They've been singing harmony with the morning blossoms." Harry smiled. Luna's unique perspective had proved invaluable in their work, her ability to see truth through conventional facades, making her an excellent teacher for young people learning to question authority. "There's something I want to show you all," Harry said, withdrawing a letter from his robes. The parchment was old, yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh, written just that morning by magical portraits who had finally been located in the ruins of the Potter family home. "A letter from your parents?" Hermione asked, her voice soft with understanding. Harry nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "The Aurors found their portraits last week, hidden in a vault beneath the house in Godric's Hollow. They'd been preserved by old family magic, but unable to communicate until someone came looking for them." He unfolded the letter and read aloud in a voice that grew steadier as he continued. "Our dearest son, Harry, we have watched, through the limited sight that portraits allow, as you discovered the truth about Albus Dumbledore and chose to act upon it. We have seen you grow from a manipulated child into a man who protects others from manipulation. We have witnessed you choose truth over comfort, justice over revenge, and love over hate. We want you to know that we are proud, not of the boy who lived, not of the chosen one, but of Harry Potter, who chose to break the cycle of manipulation and build something better in its place. Dumbledore told us we were dying for the greater good. We believed him, and we died believing our sacrifice would protect you. Now we understand that we died to advance his agenda, and that our love for you was used as a weapon against innocent people. But you have redeemed our sacrifice, Harry. You have made our deaths meaningful by ensuring that no other parents will be manipulated into abandoning their children to a madman's vision of necessity. Live, my son. Live as Harry Potter, not as anyone else's weapon or symbol. Live freely, love freely, and protect others' freedom as fiercely as you have protected your own. With all our love and pride, James and Lily Potter." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sound of tears, not of sadness, but of joy and resolution. "They understand," Hermione whispered. "They know what you did and why you did it." Harry nodded, feeling a weight he had carried for months finally lift from his shoulders. His parents' approval meant everything, not because he needed their permission, but because their love had been the foundation upon which Dumbledore had built his manipulations. To know that they supported his choices, that they recognized the necessity of exposing the truth, gave him a peace he hadn't realized he was seeking. The final phase of their gathering was dedicated to planning their newest initiative, a program that would bring young magical students to Grimmauld Place to learn about recognizing and resisting manipulation. Harry had been working with McGonagall to make it part of the required curriculum at Hogwarts, but they also wanted to reach students from other schools and countries. The house elf was carefully tending to the various plants and flowers that had been placed around Regulus's memorial, his movements gentle and reverent. "Kreacher," Harry said quietly, "I need to ask you something. You're free now, truly free, not bound to any family or house. You could go anywhere, do anything. Why do you choose to stay here?" Kreacher paused in his work and looked up at Harry with those enormous, knowing eyes. "Because this is where the truth lives now, Master Potter. This is where people come to learn how to protect themselves and others. This is where Master Regulus's vision of a better world is being built, piece by piece." The house elf straightened, his expression serious. "Kreacher chooses to be the guardian of truth and memory. When people come here and ask how the world was changed, Kreacher will tell them the story of a young man who could have chosen comfortable lies, but chose difficult truths instead." Harry felt a profound sense of completion settle over him. Everything had led to this moment. The revelations, the confrontations, the painful rebuilding, and now, finally, the understanding that he had found his true purpose. He was not the boy who lived. He was not the chosen one. He was not anyone's weapon or symbol or tool for achieving their vision of the greater good. He was Harry James Potter, a young man who had survived terrible manipulation and had chosen to use that experience to protect others from suffering the same fate. He was someone who had learned that the most important magic was not the power to destroy enemies, but the wisdom to recognize friends from manipulators and the courage to choose truth over comfort. As he prepared to leave the memorial room and begin preparations for the first group of students who would learn to protect themselves from corrupt authority, Harry paused at the window overlooking the garden where Luna's memorial flowers swayed in the evening breeze. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to teach, new opportunities to build a world where no child would ever again be groomed for sacrifice in the name of someone else's vision of the greater good. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of how much they had accomplished and the promise of how much more they could achieve, Harry Potter allowed himself to feel something he had never truly experienced before: the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to his own choices, free from manipulation, dedicated to protecting others' freedom to make their own choices. It was exactly the life he had always wanted, even when he hadn't known such a life was possible. In the growing darkness outside, London's magical community continued its slow but steady transformation into something more honest, more transparent, and more protective of individual dignity than it had been in decades. And in Grimmauld Place, the truth continued its patient work, one protected child at a time.